Jon Snow was but 8 years old when he first wandered beyond the safety of Winterfell's walls in the deep hush of a pre-dawn morning. He had awakened, restless, to the faint howling of wind outside his small bedroom window, a call that rattled through his bones and stirred within him a curiosity that would not be ignored. With the stealth one acquires by living as an unacknowledged boy in a lord's castle, neither true son nor servant, he slipped past the castle guards, through the yard where the hounds slept and beyond the stables. Outside, the moonlight cast silver across the frosted ground, and though the sky was still blanketed by night, the whites and grays of the courtyard gave enough faint illumination for a resourceful child to navigate. He had no grand plan, only a quiet eagerness to explore what lay beyond the protective battlements. He bundled himself in a thick cloak, pulled on sturdy boots, and thought briefly of Ghost, the white direwolf pup who slept at the foot of his bed. The creature was still too small to take out on adventures, Jon decided. Besides, he couldn't risk waking the castle with the pup's playful yips. He had gone alone, swallowing the hints of fear that nipped at the edges of his mind like the cold wind biting at his cheeks. He passed through the gate with surprising ease. The guards were few at this hour, most of the men roving the battlements or warming themselves by meager fires. Jon took care to stay in the darkest shadows. Soon he was beyond the walls, out where the wild wind whipped across the open expanse of the north. A sense of exhilaration welled in him. He felt somehow bolder under the black sky, beneath the bright scattering of stars, the entire castle at his back, alone in the world as it stretched ahead. The air smelled of pine and of the hidden snows that threatened to fall from the heavy clouds overhead. He trudged forward, following no path but an instinctive pull. The ground was firm and cold beneath his boots. The forest's edge loomed in the near distance, trees crowding together like tall, silent sentinels. Despite his youth, Jon had heard stories about direwolves, shadow cats, and larger terrors that lurked in the night. He reminded himself to be cautious, yet caution warred with curiosity, and curiosity spurred him onward. Had he been an ordinary child, one who felt assured in his place at Winterfell, one who could freely claim the name Stark, he might have known the small pleasures of the warm bed he'd left behind. Perhaps he'd have known the comfort of a mother's arms, too, the maternal tenderness that would scold him for leaving and then gather him close. But he was Jon Snow, the boy in limbo, neither fully accepted nor entirely cast aside. He had grown adept at navigating the cracks in the household's attention and slipping beyond them unseen. The forest was a dark, looming curtain of black trunks and tangled roots. Jon hesitated at first. Each rustle of wind through branches sounded like a sigh that might belong to some huge, hidden creature. The boy swallowed hard, imagining boars with sharp tusks or the half-whispered wraiths that old Nan told stories about. But he drew in a breath, his small gloved hand lifting to press against the rough bark of a tree at the edge. He glanced over his shoulder, saw the distant walls of Winterfell behind him, and was filled with a quiet determination to prove himself. A bastard boy who wanted to be brave. He entered the forest, stepping carefully over exposed roots. Everything became quieter beneath the tall canopy. The wind still moaned, but it was more distant, as if it skirted around the perimeter of this place. Snow began to drift from the sky, tiny flakes swirling like lazy fireflies in the gloom. Jon paused whenever a twig snapped underfoot. He worried that noise might summon the hounds or men from Winterfell. But no one came. No one called for him. He pressed on. He did not know how deep he walked into the forest, nor how long he had been away. Time seemed strange beneath the labyrinth of tree limbs. He had half a mind to turn back, thinking that perhaps he had gone far enough, that if he returned at once, no one would notice his absence. But he kept going, one step after another, until his breath came in shallow puffs that fogged in front of his face and his cheeks burned from the cold. Some ways deeper, he came upon a small clearing. The moon, momentarily freed of clouds, shed pale white light that revealed a scattering of footprints in the fresh dusting of snow. Footprints larger than any a child would make, and though faint, they were unusual. The edges of them looked strangely sharp, too symmetrical, and something in them glittered faintly, a crystalline sheen that reminded him of ice. John crouched, breath caught in his throat, and looked about with sudden dread. In the trees it was deathly quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals foraging in the dead leaves. The hush pressed around him, thick as a blanket, but it was not comforting. It felt ominous, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. John's heart began to thud painfully. Somewhere deeper in the darkness, a soft crack sounded, like frozen branches snapping underfoot. He stood swiftly and backed away, the sense of being watched prickling the nape of his neck. The footprints stretched forward, weaving away, and every instinct told him to run back to Winterfell. But that old curiosity, sharper now, fought for his attention. He wanted to see what had left those prints, what manner of man or beast walked in such silence. Even then, young though he was, he realized that to do so was dangerous. Yet the moment he hesitated, he felt a chill ripple across his skin that had nothing to do with the winter air. A shadow passed between the trees, nearly invisible except for the faint shimmer around its edges. John tried to hide behind a trunk, flattening himself against the rough bark, heart hammering in his chest. Carefully, he peered around. He saw something moving in the clearing with an impossibly graceful glide, pale as old snow. The shape was tall, taller than any man. It wore armor that seemed to glint with the cold luminescence of moonlight on ice. John's breath stuck in his lungs. He had heard old Nan's tales of the others, the White Walkers, creatures of living ice with eyes like blue stars. He had never entirely believed them. He could scarcely believe now what he was seeing before his very eyes. Standing there amidst the hush of the forest was a being whose presence exuded a lethal, ancient grace. The figure's face looked almost like that of a man, but elongated with unnatural angles, and it was crowned with a helmet of ice or bone. John could not say which. Its eyes, a bright and ethereal blue, glowed faintly, turned its head as if sniffing the air, listening or searching. Then its gaze swept across the clearing, so briefly that John almost thought it had looked straight at him. The boy did not dare to breathe. Another was there, too, slighter in frame but similarly garbed, similarly frightening. The second one's armor rustled with a sound like crackling frost. They stood impossibly still. Then, after a moment, they moved, soundless, deeper into the forest. They glided away. John remained rigid where he was, petrified, all of him numb with cold and shock. He had seen a White Walker. He knew it in his bones. When he could move again, he discovered that his legs were trembling, his palms damp with sweat despite the frigid air. He forced himself to follow at a distance, too afraid to remain alone in the clearing, too terrified not to see where the beings went. Twice he nearly lost sight of them. They traveled with uncanny speed, silent across the snow and the rotting leaves beneath. John noticed that every so often, their footfalls left behind a strange, glittering mark in the fresh frost. Eventually, they paused. John kept well behind the nearest wide tree trunk. In the faint glimmer of moonlight, he saw a shape on the ground. His breath hitched. It was a dead wolf, a hulking gray beast with thick fur. It bore no sign of having been slaughtered by any natural means. There was no blood on the snow, no visible wound. The White Walkers knelt beside it, one of them placing a spidery, inhuman hand upon its flank. An instant later, the wolf's body began to jerk. Its limbs twitched, and ice crackled across its pelt. John stared in absolute horror as it rose to unsteady feet, an undead mockery of the powerful creature it had been. Its eyes shone with the same cold blue light as its unnatural masters. John backed away, nearly stumbling over a root. The noise he made, small though it was, echoed in his own ears like thunder in the silence. One of the White Walker's heads snapped up, the frozen, angular face turning toward the source of the sound. Panicked, John turned on his heel and ran. He crashed through undergrowth, branches tearing at his cloak, the sting of cold air searing his lungs. At times, he thought he heard something behind him, a whisper of movement, a hiss of icy wind, but he did not dare look over his shoulder to confirm. His only focus was to escape, He had never run so fast in his life. He did not know how long he sprinted. Time felt unreal. At last, exhaustion overcame him, and he stumbled out of the forest, panting. The walls of Winterfell were a comforting sight in the distance. Jon forced his shaking legs to carry him toward them. In the courtyard, the guard on duty nearly mistook him for an intruder. Jon had no capacity for stealth now. The boy's face was white with terror, his hair damp with sweat, eyes wide as the moon. The guard called out, alarmed, and soon others came running. They surrounded Jon. Some recognized him. Maester Luwin was summoned, along with Roderick Castle. Jon could only manage broken words. In the woods, white, ice monsters. Before his consciousness began to slip, he shivered uncontrollably, cold down to the marrow of his bones. News traveled quickly through the castle. Eddard Stark, Ned to his friends, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, was roused from bed. Clad in a fur cloak hastily thrown over a plain woolen nightshirt, he hurried to the courtyard where he found his bastard son shaking like a leaf, Maester Luwin supporting the child. At first, Ned's expression was stern. He chided Jon for venturing out alone, for frightening everyone and risking his life. But as soon as he got a proper look at the boy's face, Ned's tone softened into concern. He ordered Jon to be taken inside, to be warmed, and to receive a thorough examination. Jon, half delirious with cold and shock, mumbled words that chilled Ned's blood. White Walkers saw them. They brought the dead to life. He repeated it again and again until exhaustion stole his speech entirely. It seemed impossible, like a child's nightmare or a distortion of old Nan's ghost stories. But Ned Stark knew the weight of fear in a boy's eyes. He had seen it before too many times. Something had truly terrified Jon. Could it have been an albino animal, or perhaps masked brigands from beyond the normal routes? Yet the name White Walkers had not passed the lips of any living person in many centuries. They were creatures of myth, dismissed by the practical minds of the modern North. But as he looked at Jon's gray face and trembling form, Ned felt a pang of alarm that refused to be shaken off. Maester Luwin tended to Jon through the early hours, applying warm compresses, giving him a mixture of herbal tea to calm his racing heart. Ned listened to the boy's fragmented tale once more when Jon regained enough composure to speak. This time, Ned heard how these beings wore armor that shimmered like ice, had eyes bright blue, and raised a dead wolf with their mere touch. Ned listened carefully, rubbing his brow. He asked a few quiet questions. Jon answered as best he could, tears of pure terror threatening to slip down his cheeks. Ned found himself glancing at Maester Luwin. Luwin had parted his lips, perhaps to offer a rational explanation, but he closed them again, seeing the look on Ned's face. The Lord of Winterfell had always been a rational, honorable man, not one given to flights of fancy or base superstition. For him to be so disturbed by this story spoke volumes. Ned ordered a group of men, led by Ser Roderick Castle, Winterfell's master-at-arms, to investigate at first light. Jon, in tears, insisted they must not wait, that the creatures could be gone by morning. But Ned shook his head. To send men blundering in the dark after legendary nightmares would be foolhardy. If they truly existed, they would find signs. If not, best not to risk more lives in the blackness of night. Roderick and his men rode out as the horizon paled to a cold, gray dawn. Jon, determined to accompany them, was firmly told no. Instead, Ned allowed his older son Robb to ride along if he remained safely in the back ranks. Robb, a boy of nearly Jon's age but recognized as a true Stark, had always been braver than was strictly wise. Ned worried, but he also knew that stifling his heir's spirit would do more harm than good. The party set off, every man armed and wrapped in heavy cloaks, for the winter winds bit more keenly than usual. Jon sat by a window in one of Winterfell's towers, watching them go. Maester Luwin was at his side, cautioning him to rest, but Jon could not quell the pounding of his heart. All that day, Jon paced nervously around the great hall, the godswood, the courtyard. Ghost, sensing his unease, trailed at his heels. The direwolf pup whined and nuzzled his hand, offering comfort in the way only a beast can. Hours passed in dreadful slowness. Servants whispered among themselves, for it was plain that something grave weighed on their lord's mind. Catelyn Stark, Ned's wife, asked repeatedly what was happening, but Ned gave her only vague answers, unwilling to stoke fear over what might be an illusion or a hoax. She regarded Jon with anxious eyes, rarely one to lavish motherly affection on him. She still recognized something was truly amiss. When dusk approached, the search party returned. Their faces were drawn, eyes unsettled. A hush fell over the courtyard as they came in. Ned hurried out to meet them, his breath fogging in the chill. Robb jumped down from his horse and ran to Ned, lips parted in an urgent expression. Roderick Castle dismounted more slowly, and when he pulled off his gloves, Ned saw that the master-at-arms' hands shook. They spoke in quiet tones. They had found traces, footprints that froze the ground too deeply, impossible patterns in the snow as though something unnaturally cold had passed. At one spot, they found the remains of a great gray wolf, larger than any common variety. It lay collapsed in a small clearing, hide frosted with ice. Its eyes were clouded and lifeless. At first, they thought it must be a simple corpse, but the men felt an eerie chill that lingered in the air, a sense that the forest itself recoiled from what had occurred there. No living White Walkers were to be seen, though. No sign of them beyond that. The men spoke of how the forest had gone silent in places, as if every bird and beast had fled. They returned uneasy, uncertain. Most refused to say outright that it could have been the others. To do so was to invite old terrors back into the realm of men. But the evidence was enough to tell Ned that Jon had seen something far outside the ordinary. He could see the fear in Robb's eyes, the same fear that lingered in each grown man's gaze, though they tried to hide it behind stoic faces. Ned realized with a dawning dread that if there was even a kernel of truth to the boy's claims, the entire North, and all the 7 kingdoms, could be in grave danger. Ned led a private council in the Great Solar that evening. Around the wooden table sat Maester Luwin, Roderick Castle, Robb, who insisted on being included, and several of Ned's most trusted bannermen who resided at Winterfell or nearby. Among them were Galbart Glover and Wyman Manderly, men known for their loyalty and pragmatic minds. Jon was invited to speak only once, to recount exactly what he had seen, then was sent away with Ghost to rest. Jon did not catch much of the discussion after that, but from just outside the thick oak door, he heard raised voices. Some men scoffed at the idea that the others had returned, claiming it a children's tale gone wild. Others demanded immediate action, urging Ned to send out larger patrols, to alert the Night's Watch. Maester Luwin suggested that it might be wildlings wearing costumes of ice or pale leather, though he admitted the cold footprints were harder to explain. Ned's voice, calm yet firm, reminded everyone that the safety of the North was at stake. If the others had truly returned, ignoring the threat would be more disastrous than any misstep of overpreparation. Eventually, the meeting ended. Men left with grim expressions, whispering among themselves about old legends. Ned emerged last. He saw Jon waiting down the corridor, the boy anxious to learn what would be done. With a weary look, Ned beckoned him to come closer. "I believe you," he said quietly, resting a hand on Jon's shoulder. "I don't understand it, but I believe you saw something dreadful." He knelt then, looking into Jon's eyes. "This is not your burden to bear alone. I will do what I must to protect my family and my people. But you must do as I say and stay safe. No more wandering beyond the walls by yourself." Jon nodded, relief mingling with residual fear. He felt tears threaten again but forced them back. In that moment, hearing Ned's vow, he sensed a warmth and acceptance he had rarely felt before. It was fleeting, overshadowed by the magnitude of the danger he had witnessed, but it was a moment nonetheless. What happened next rattled the entire North. Ned Stark called the bannermen to assemble, not for open war, but for a vigilant readiness. Small garrisons were dispatched to guard key roads and passes, particularly the areas south of the wall where any intruders might descend. Even more significant, Ned sent ravens to the Night's Watch, informing them of this potential threat. The men of the Night's Watch were sworn to defend against wildlings and graver perils. Yet in recent centuries, they had become reduced in numbers and overshadowed by the realm's political squabbles. If the others had returned, the wall would be the first line of defense. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Gior Mormont, wrote back swiftly. His letter expressed deep concern. He did not mock the idea of White Walkers, having heard enough strange tales from beyond the wall. He recounted the stories of rangers who went missing, the odd sightings near the Frostfangs. He requested additional men, though he doubted how many would be spared from the houses of the north. Ned read the Raven's reply by the glow of candlelight, brow furrowed. He made arrangements to send a contingent of able soldiers north, men who would volunteer for service in the Watch. Though the Starks had always been loyal to the Watch's cause, rarely did they send so many at once. But Ned felt compelled to act. The realm was wide, and winter was coming. Months passed in uneasy vigilance. The north stirred with rumors. White Walkers or half-frozen whites, or an unholy presence. Villagers living near the edges of the forest spoke of seeing flickers of pale figures at dusk. Some said it was only illusions conjured by the wind and the dancing northern lights, but others were certain they had glimpsed something unnatural. The scattered sightings did not coalesce into a direct confrontation, yet Ned took none of it lightly. He would rather prepare for the worst and be proven wrong than ignore the possibility and lose everything. And winter fell. Life continued with a veneer of normalcy. Bran, Rickon, and even Arya were too young to fully sense the tension in the hallways, but they felt the change. More guards patrolled the walls. Ned spent hours reading old records or speaking in hushed tones with Maester Luwin. Jon became quiet and withdrawn. The terror of that night in the forest had receded slightly, replaced by a simmering worry that dogged him daily. He tried to resume his routine, lessons in the small library, training with wooden swords alongside Robb. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he remembered that glowing pair of blue eyes in the darkness. Ghost, seeming to sense Jon's turmoil, was never far from his side, growing larger with each passing moon, his fur the color of freshly fallen snow. Sometime after the ravens flew, a wave of new arrivals came to Winterfell. Some were envoys from bannermen, come to discuss the mysteries that Ned had warned of. Others came seeking protection, alarmed by the rumors. Catelyn Stark tried to keep order, ensuring supplies were stocked and that visitors were offered rooms according to their station. Her face bore lines of worry as well. She had never been comfortable with the unknown, particularly where it concerned Jon Snow, the boy who was both inside and outside her family. That winter, she saw how her husband treated Jon with a heightened protectiveness, and it twisted her own feelings in ways she could not fully articulate. She never allowed it to show publicly, but the tension weighed on her. Then came a day when a group of Night's Watch recruiters arrived at Winterfell, led by a lanky man called Yoren. They brought unsettling news. The Watch had sent more rangers beyond the wall to investigate strange killings of free folk villages. The rangers had not returned. Tracks of whites were supposedly found near the Frostfangs. Yoren himself, grim-faced, insisted he had seen things that convinced him of the others' reality. He went so far as to ask for more steel, more manpower. Ned, in the Great Hall, promised to do what he could. Jon listened from the shadows, feeling cold dread swirl in his belly. It was all coming closer to the realm of reality, no longer just the boy's frightening recollection. If the others truly roamed again, how long before they assembled in a force that would sweep down upon the living? In response to the growing crisis, Ned decided he must ride to White Harbor, the seat of House Manderley, to gather more supplies and ships that might be sent to Eastwatch by the sea. He would also convene with other lords to discuss the matter. Many voices advised him to remain at Winterfell, but he was resolute. As Warden of the North, he needed to ensure that the entire territory was united and prepared. He might have gone alone, but the presence of the others changed everything. Instead, he took a protective retinue with him, including some of his best swordsmen. Robb, as heir, would remain behind to manage Winterfell. Jon hoped to accompany Ned, but Catelyn, stepping in with an unusual severity, insisted the boy stay. "This is no time to be dragging children into further danger," she said. Perhaps she was genuinely concerned for his safety, or perhaps she simply wanted to keep John from overshadowing her own sons. Ned, not wanting strife, agreed, though John saw reluctance in his eyes. In the days leading to Ned's departure, John found it difficult to sleep. A sense of doom weighed upon him. Every time Ned left Winterfell for any significant duration, John feared losing him forever. This time, that fear felt magnified by the dread of the White Walkers. The boy spent much of the night in the Godswood, pacing near the ancient weirwood tree, a face carved in its trunk watching him with red, sap-filled eyes. He would speak to the old gods, though he was not certain they listened. He prayed that Ned would return safely, that the others would not strike unexpectedly, that the realm would unite to face them. He prayed for something he could not quite name, a sense of belonging that he had never fully possessed. Finally, the morning of the departure arrived. Ned embraced each of his children, even a squirming Arya who had come to see him off, and Rickon, who clung to his father's leg. John stood back, uncertain, until Ned turned to him. Without hesitation, Ned rested a hand on John's shoulder. "Remember your lessons, keep practicing with your sword, and look after your siblings," he said softly. "We must stand together, all of us, Stark and Snow alike." John swallowed hard and nodded, feeling a surge of emotion he could scarcely articulate. Then Ned mounted his horse, signaled his men, and they rode out into the cold northern light. With Winterfell's lord gone, an uneasy hush settled over the castle. People went about their daily tasks, but the tension was palpable in every corridor. Ser Roderick Castle led additional patrols in the outlying areas. Reports came in that the free folk beyond the wall were gathering in greater numbers, fleeing something they would not name. The Night's Watch was stretched thin, attempting to contain them. The possibilities weighed on John. He had nightmares of seeing those bright blue eyes among the trees, hearing the crunch of frost beneath inhuman feet. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, ghosts standing watch over him. As the weeks dragged by, short lines of ravens came and went with messages from Ned, from the Watch, from the loyal bannermen. Preparations continued. Manderley was cooperative, sending shipments of grain, salted fish, and casks of mead north by barge. The roads were patrolled by House Glover and House Serwin men. Still, no direct attack materialized. The White Walkers were elusive as shadows, if they prowled at all. Winter had not yet fully descended, but the signs were clear in the skies and in the biting air. Snow fell more frequently. Food became more precious. The realm seemed poised on the edge of something long and harsh. John tried to fulfill Ned's directive. He diligently attended his lessons, though he found it difficult to concentrate on histories when the threat of the others loomed so near. He trained with a wooden sword under Ser Roderick's guidance. Robb sparred against him frequently. Sansa was polite but distant, preoccupied with her own ladle-like training. Arya occasionally practiced with them, informally in secret corners of the courtyard, but soon tired of the disciplined stances. She wanted to fight as a water dancer, she would declare, jabbing the air with a pretend needle. Bran, still too small for real sparring, watched them with wide eyes. Meanwhile, Catelyn oversaw the stewardship of Winterfell in Ned's absence, frowning each time she saw Jon training. But there were more urgent matters at hand, so she let it pass with a tight-lipped expression. Then came a day of bitter wind, the sky heavy with the promise of a blizzard. A raven arrived from Castle Black. The letter was short, scrawled in haste. A ranger patrol had stumbled upon an encampment of whites some leagues north of the wall. The confrontation left 2 rangers dead, and the undead were driven back only after steel and fire were used. More disturbingly, one of the whites had been recognized as a ranger who had vanished weeks ago. The letter ended with an urgent plea for reinforcements. The threat was real, the threat was here. The news caused a stir throughout Winterfell. Some of the small folk whispered that the end of days had come, that the ancient evil from the Age of Heroes had returned. Jon felt a hollow terror coil in his stomach. His worst fears were being confirmed. The White Walkers were truly raising the dead, just as he had witnessed with that wolf in the forest. Could an army of undead be massing in the frozen wastelands beyond the wall? Rob tried to reassure him, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "We'll stand strong. Father will see to it," he said, though John could sense the tremor of doubt beneath his bravado. Even the guards walked with haunted expressions. If the creatures advanced south, the watch might be overrun. And if the watch fell, soon after, a second raven arrived, this one from Ned. He had learned of the Ranger's fate and was preparing to leave White Harbor, gather more men from the outlying regions, then ride for the wall. He wanted his presence there to bolster morale and to see for himself what horrors threatened the north. The letter also instructed that more skilled archers be dispatched from Winterfell, if possible, to join the defense. Ned wrote, "If the threat is real, we must be a shield for all living souls. We have no choice but to gather our strength at the wall itself. Prepare accordingly." That command stirred something in John. He burned to ride to the wall himself, to stand guard and see that the others did not take any more lives. But he was only a boy, a bastard boy at that, with no official place among the grown knights and soldiers. Caitlin refused the notion outright when John brought it up to her timidly. She reminded him that Ned had instructed him to stay in Winterfell, and as she was the lady of the castle in Ned's absence, he was bound to obey. John tried not to let the bitterness show. He was old enough to know that bastard children rarely had the luxury of forging their own destinies. Yet fate, as ever, had its own plans. The blizzard that threatened soon arrived, blanketing the region in thick snowdrifts, making travel difficult. For 2 full days, the storm howled, wind shrieking across the battlements, piling snow against the gates. Inside the great keep, fires roared in the hearths, but the chill seeped in through stone walls. Everyone wore heavy cloaks even indoors. Food was rationed more carefully, for no one knew how long the storm might last. John had trouble sleeping. He would wake in the night, hearing the wind moan, half convinced it was the cry of the White Walkers, out there in the storm. Finally, the wind began to die down. The courtyard lay buried under a sheen of fresh white. Rob organized a group of men to shovel the snow from the main paths. The mood was subdued, a hush broken only by the scrape of shovels and the thick crunch of boots in the drifts. Sansa and Arya had bickered earlier about who would assist and who should remain inside, but eventually, both found chores to occupy them. Bran and Rickon stomped about, building lumps of snow that vaguely resembled snowmen. Jon, for his part, was helping to stack barrels of salt fish near the kitchen entrance. The labor was not thrilling, but it kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too much. Near midday, just as the men finally cleared a path from the main gate, a shout arose from the ramparts. "Riders!" Through the swirling remnants of snow outside, the silhouettes of horses emerged. Rob hurried to the gate, ordering it opened enough for the riders to pass. They were 3 in number, cloaked in thick furs crusted with ice. Each looked exhausted, half frozen. The moment they dismounted, one collapsed into the arms of the waiting guards. Roderick Castle rushed forward, his white whiskers bristling with concern. Rob, tall for his age, demanded an explanation. Between shivers, one of the riders gasped that they were from Castle Serwin, dispatched to bring urgent news. The next words turned every face pale. "A white! We had it caged. It broke free. Serwin men killed. Lady Serwin. Oh gods!" He trailed off, breath hitching in horror. It was all so sudden. A demon of ice. The White Walkers. They came. Rob's eyes widened. Roderick Castle called for healers, for the men were clearly on the verge of collapsing. Gently, they were escorted inside the hall, given blankets and hot mulled wine. Jon lingered in the background, eavesdropping as he often did, heart thundering. The men's story was disjointed. They spoke of discovering a single undead wildling near their holdfast, capturing it in hopes of sending it to Winterfell as proof. But it had roused in the night, killed its guards with unnatural strength, and opened the way for more horrors that seemed to descend on the holdfast. Some men glimpsed figures that might have been White Walkers, a tall presence with eyes like frozen flames, striking at the castle's outskirts. The Holdfast's garrison fought back valiantly, but panic took hold. In the confusion, the messenger party managed to slip away and ride for Winterfell, though one of their number froze to death en route. The survivors had spent 2 days in the snowstorm, trying to reach the seat of House Stark. As soon as they finished their story, a hush fell in the hall, broken only by the crackling of flames in the hearth. Robb pressed his lips together. He was only a boy of 15, but he stood tall, trying to show the commanding presence of a Stark. Rodrik, older and more experienced, took the lead. He asked the men if Castle Serwin still stood. They did not know. When they fled, it was still under attack, men forming a shield wall in the courtyard. But they feared the worst, for the undead did not tire, and the White Walkers, if indeed they were truly present, were said to be unstoppable. Robb exchanged a desperate glance with Rodrik. They needed to act, but how? Jon's blood pounded. Castle Serwin was only a few days' ride from Winterfell in normal conditions, less now that the roads were clearer. If the others were attacking Holdfast so close to the Stark stronghold, the entire north could be on the verge of collapse. He wanted to help. He wanted to fight back, to stand with Robb and defend the north. Yet he had no official capacity to do so. He was still the bastard boy, overshadowed by all the great men and their swords. But a fury rose in his chest at the thought of these monsters slaughtering innocent people. He felt as though he had unleashed them himself by discovering them in the woods that night. Robb and Rodrik conferred urgently. Winterfell could not sit idle while neighbors were overrun. They needed to rally what forces they had left and march to Castle Serwin's aid. However, part of their garrison was already dispatched to the roads, and Ned was absent with a good number of fighting men. The remaining soldiers in Winterfell were not many. Could they muster enough to stand against an army of undead? They had the walls, but Castle Serwin did not. Still, the principle of feudal loyalty demanded they not abandon a liege lord's sworn allies. Honor required action, and the threat demanded it all the more. If the White Walkers gained a foothold, they would only grow stronger. Ser Rodrik decided. They would march. He assembled a force of approximately 100 men, half cavalry and half foot, as swiftly as the snow-cleared roads allowed. Robb insisted upon joining them. As Ned's heir, it was his duty. Rodrik agreed, though with reservations. They would bring some extra supplies of dragonglass, an ancient precaution gleaned from old tales. Maester Luwin rummaged through Winterfell stores, producing a small chest of obsidian daggers and arrowheads that had been stored away as curiosities. Robb gave orders that the black glass be carried with them, though few had faith in such artifacts. Fire and steel, that was what they knew. Still, it was worth a chance. Jon stood on the periphery, brimming with conflicting emotions. He wanted to volunteer, but no one had asked. Then, as the men were suiting up, Robb found Jon in the courtyard. A glint in the young lord's eyes suggested he knew exactly how Jon felt. "We ride soon," he said. "Wait for me by the armory." Then he strode off, calling for Theon Greyjoy and other companions. Jon's heart hammered. A short time later, Robb returned, accompanied by Theon, who wore a cocky grin, half excitement and half nervous tension. Robb looked Jon over. "I want you with me," he said, and Theon smirked. "You can hold your own with a sword well enough for a boy. If we face the others, we'll need every blade." Robb's tone was somewhat forced in its confidence, as if repeating a line he'd prepared. Jon blinked in surprise and relief, but also fear. He was only 8, nearly 9, not quite the same as the Nearman Robb, who was 15 and had an air of budding leadership. But the memory of those glowing blue eyes, the image of helpless men and women slaughtered by whites, it compelled Jon to accept at once. He nodded fiercely, as if grown. Theon slapped him on the back. "Don't wet yourself out there, Snow." Jon scowled, but said nothing. He hurried to prepare, fetching a small sword from the armory that had been forged for older boys in training. It was not Valyrian steel or anything fancy, just plain castle-forged metal. He belted it around his waist, breathed deeply, and tried not to show how his hands trembled. Ghost padded at his heels, silent and watchful, the dire wolf almost up to John's waist by now. Perhaps the dire wolf understood that a battle was coming. John could only hope Ghost would not be put in danger. By midday, the troop was assembled in the courtyard. 100 men in battered leathers and mail, some mounted, others on foot, all ringed by tension. Rob sat astride a horse, wearing a breastplate adorned with the direwolf sigil, a sword at his side that had once been too large for him, though now he wielded it with decent skill. Roderick Castle, with a lifetime's worth of discipline, took position near the front. Theon Greyjoy, wearing a confident smirk to mask his nerves, was near Rob. John lingered off to the side, astride a smaller horse borrowed from the stables, with Ghost trotting alongside in the snow. Catelyn Stark emerged on the steps leading from the keep, face pale. She approached Rob, voice trembling as she urged him to be cautious, to remember that he was the future of House Stark. He nodded solemnly, promising that he would return triumphant. John she regarded warily, uncertain whether to protest his presence. But events were already in motion. She took a breath and retreated inside, leaving the men to their purpose. The gates opened, and the column rode forth, slogging through snowdrifts at first, then hitting the road that had been partially cleared. The sky was a leaden gray, promising more snow to come. The wind had calmed, but the air was cold enough that each breath stung the throat. They traveled as quickly as conditions allowed, knowing that every moment could mean the difference between life and death for those at Castle Serwin. They camped that night in a sheltered copse of pines, the men taking turns on watch. No one wanted to think of what might be lurking in the darkness. John huddled near a small fire, cloak wrapped tight, Ghost at his side. Rob dozed across from him, sword at the ready. Tension filled the icy air. An hour before dawn, the patrol on watch cried out, having sighted movement in the distance. Instantly, men sprang awake, weapons in hand, hearts pounding. But it was only a wandering group of travelers from a nearby village, half-frozen and seeking safety. They told dreadful tales of hearing shrieks in the night, of glimpsing corpses walking. Roderick told them to stay near the camp for now, to eat from the communal pot of stew. The watchers returned to their anxious vigilance. At dawn, they broke camp and pressed on. The roads were mostly deserted, and they spotted the occasional abandoned farmstead. Tension built with each mile. After midday, the dark silhouette of Castle Serwin appeared on the horizon, perched upon a low rise. Smoke drifted from behind its walls, too thick and black to be ordinary cooking fires. The men exchanged grim looks, quickening their pace. The outer gate stood twisted and splintered, as if forced open. The small fields around the castle were churned with footprints, many of them half obliterated by fresh snow. Bodies lay scattered, half buried in drifts. John felt blew rise in his throat at the sight of a peasant woman's frozen face, eyes staring blankly at the sky. He forced himself to look away. They entered the courtyard cautiously. The main keep door was battered, a gaping hole in the heavy wood. Crows circled overhead, cawing. At first, there was an eerie silence, just the whistling of wind through the ruined gate. Then they heard it, a faint scraping sound, followed by a low, mournful groan. The men spread out, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. Rob, at the front, tried to steady his mount, which shied nervously. Theon spat a curse, scanning the shadows. From behind a collapsed portion of the courtyard wall, a figure emerged. At first, it might have been mistaken for a man, until its face turned to them. Its skin was ashen, lips pulled back to reveal clenched teeth. Its eyes glowed a faint, sickly blue. Blackened blood stained its ragged clothing, which bore the Serwin sigil. The wight lurched forward, arms raised as if in a desperate reach. Ser Roderick shouted, "Form up!" Immediately, archers lifted bows and loosed. The wight staggered under the impact of several arrows, but it did not fall. Another arrow took it in the knee, bringing it to a kneel, yet still it tried to crawl. Only when a man rushed forth and decapitated it with a heavy swing did it stop moving. Even then, its limbs twitched blindly. The men recoiled in horror. Sudden movement on the parapets made them look up. More figures, whites, scrambled across the stone, climbing down with unnatural agility, or simply dropping to the courtyard below. The men of Winterfell found themselves beset from multiple directions. A chaotic fight broke out, steel ringing against undead flesh. The whites clawed and bit, impervious to pain. It took overwhelming force or decapitation to bring them down. Archers loosed arrows in rapid succession, but many times those struck whites in the torso or limbs, doing little to slow them. Some had the presence of mind to aim for the head. The courtyard turned into a tangle of struggling shapes, men shouting as they tried to defend themselves. Horses reared, threatened by these unnatural foes. Ghosts snarled, sinking teeth into the leg of a wight that nearly overtook Jon. Jon, sword in hand, found his breath ragged with terror. He had never been in a real battle, let alone one against the undead. The smell of rot and the swirl of snow made it difficult to see. He ducked the swipe of a withered hand. Heart pounding, he swung his blade. It lodged in the white side, nearly stuck in the ribcage. Jon yanked it free, stumbling. Another white lunged at him. It had been a Serwin guard in life, chainmail now blackened with gore. Jon barely managed to parry. He shouted, voice cracking. Theon, from a few paces away, finished the creature off with a spear thrust to the back of its skull. Then Theon turned, smirked grimly at Jon, and spun to engage another foe. Ser Rodrik roared orders, rallying the men into a defensive line near the keep's entrance. They had to clear the courtyard systematically. Robb, face set with determination, waded into the fight. He parried the blows of one wight with his shield, slashed at its neck, and severed its head. Meanwhile, several more advanced from behind, forcing men to turn and defend multiple angles. A few wights fell to the black obsidian arrowheads that some archers had hastily fitted, and those wights collapsed instantly, as though the obsidian carried a magic that unbound them. This fed rumors from the old tales. Dragonglass was lethal to the others and their creations. The men called for more obsidian weapons, but they had only a small supply. After what felt like a nightmarish eternity, the courtyard went silent except for panting breath and the moans of wounded men. Blood stained the snow. Some wights still twitched, missing arms or heads, but enough had been dispatched that the immediate threat was gone. The survivors took stock. A dozen of Winterfell's men lay dead, more injured. Jon himself sported a shallow cut across his forearm. He pressed a trembling hand to it, tears threatening, though not from pain alone. Robb's eyes scanned the area, still ablaze with adrenaline. Theon, breathing hard, leaned against a broken cart, shaking his head at the carnage. Inside, Ser Rodrik said, voice rough, we must see if anyone within still lives. They advanced carefully, lanterns held high. The keep was cold and dark, the torches on the walls long burned out. The interior corridors showed signs of struggle. Overturned chairs, scorched patches where someone had tried to start a fire. Now and then, a door was splintered inwards. More bodies, many days old, lay in corners or behind barricaded thresholds. A handful of living survivors were found huddled in a locked storeroom. A blacksmith's apprentice, a maid, and an old Serwin retainer. They emerged, shaken and half-starved, grateful to see Starks. The retainer could hardly speak, but the maid murmured about how the whites came at night, clawing their way inside. Lord Serwin himself had fought valiantly, but was dragged down by a white walker, a tall figure of living ice that froze men's blood with its gaze. After that, everything fell apart. The few who hadn't fled or died locked themselves away. A deeper hush took hold. They found no living White Walkers. If the creatures had been here, they were gone. Only the whites remained, attacking blindly. Rodrik surmised that the White Walkers must have departed after unleashing enough whites to decimate the castle. Perhaps they had moved on to the next target. The question tore at every mind. Where would they strike next? Robb, brow furrowed, looked to Rodrik. We have to fortify this place, he said, voice tight. And the next, or we ride after them. We can't let them roam free. But with so few men, the idea of pursuing White Walkers was daunting. Theon grimaced, muttering that they needed more manpower, more weapons. Roderick agreed. The only hope lay in reuniting with Ned, or with other northern houses that had mustered forces. Castle Serwin itself was in no state to house a large garrison. The walls were compromised, the supplies low. Decisions were made quickly, for the living still needed to survive the night. The men secured the gate, burned the remains of the whites, and tended to the wounded. They established a watch. Jon watched the pyres with a knot in his gut. The stench of burning flesh turned his stomach, but fear of undead reanimation forced them to burn their own dead as well. "We'll take their ashes back to Winterfell," Robb said softly, grimly, as if to honor them. The men nodded, though their expressions were hollow. That night was long and cold. At intervals, howls echoed on the wind, sending men to the walls with bows at the ready. But no further attack came. At dawn, they set about burying Serwin's dead and salvaging what supplies they could. The living survivors were in no condition to rebuild. Roderick decided that they should accompany Winterfell's men back, or else follow them to meet Lord Stark's host. It might be the only chance they had. A sense of heavy defeat weighed on the group. Yes, they had killed whites, but the White Walkers were out there, orchestrating these attacks with an intelligence far beyond the mindless dead. Robb and Roderick assembled the men. Carts were loaded with the injured and the traumatized survivors. The question was whether to remain at Serwin a while longer or move immediately. Some argued that the White Walkers might return. Others said they could come at any time, so best to leave swiftly. Roderick ultimately gave the order. They would move out by midday, heading back toward Winterfell until they could link up with Ned's returning forces. No one wanted to linger. The keep was a tomb now. Jon helped load supplies, hands still trembling from the memories of undead faces. Ghost, vigilant, sniffed at the air, occasionally growling as though sensing something beyond mortal sight. Each time, Jon shuddered. He tried to be brave, to appear like a soldier in the eyes of the older men, but inside he was a whirl of fear and questions. Why were the White Walkers returning now, after thousands of years? Why were they so intent on destroying every holdfast in their path? By midday, the column left Castle Serwin. Smoke still rose from the smoldering pyres, black pillars against the bleached sky. The men were quieter now, all sense of youthful bravado smothered by the reality of the threat. They moved slowly, hampered by the wounded. Snowflakes drifted lazily from thick clouds above. Jon found himself riding near Robb, who led with a grim determination. Theon was off to the side, scanning the treeline. Ser Roderick took point, watchful for any sign of an ambush. At times, the only sound was the crunch of hooves and boots in the snow, and the labored breathing of men exhausted by battle. The route back was uneasy. Although they did not encounter more whites, the pervasive feeling of being watched haunted them. Ghost's ears would prick up at intervals, but the dire wolf never bolted. After 2 days of travel, they reached the outskirts of Winterfell's territory. Word had preceded them that Castle Serwin had fallen. A small party from Winterfell met them on the road, bearing news of Ned Stark's approach from the west. Relief and apprehension mingled in Robb's face. They needed Ned's guidance, needed a leader who could unite all these scattered efforts. At the same time, the tidings of Serwin's destruction would wound him deeply. Indeed, the next day, Ned Stark's host appeared. He had gathered nearly 500 men, a mix of Manderly levies, Glover soldiers, and other northern houses. They traveled with supply wagons. When Ned saw the battered state of Roderick's troop, noticed the vacant look in some men's eyes and the bandaged wounds, his face grew dark. He embraced Robb wordlessly, then rested a hand on Jon's shoulder, as if to assure himself that the boy was still breathing. Jon saw pain and fury warring in his uncle-father's expression. "What happened?" Ned asked, voice low. Ser Roderick recounted the events, leaving nothing out. Ned's eyes flicked between the men, settling on Jon at times. He learned that Jon had fought, that the boy had taken up arms. Ned's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, overshadowed by the bigger horror of the White Walkers' attack. They conferred then, discussing strategy. With 500 men, well-equipped and bolstered by Ned's leadership, perhaps they could retake Castle Serwin fully, restore its walls, make it a fortress from which to coordinate. But Roderick pointed out the structural damage to the gatehouse and keep, the limited provisions. Others argued that Winterfell, with its thicker walls and stores, would be the safer rallying point, though it was more centrally located. They debated whether to press on to the wall, where the Night's Watch was in peril. Ned seemed torn. Every direction presented a crisis. The White Walkers could strike at any moment, from any angle. Riding the entire host to the wall would leave the interior of the north vulnerable. Yet ignoring the watch could allow the others to build strength unopposed in the far north. The men all looked to Ned for guidance, for he was the warden of the north. At last, Ned spoke, his voice steady. "We have to hold the north together. The wall must be reinforced, but if we lose control of our heartlands, that won't matter. The White Walkers would overrun us from behind while we're engaged in the far north. The immediate threat is at our doorstep. Castle Serwin was proof of that. We cannot abandon our lands. We must gather more houses, more swords, and secure Winterfell as our stronghold. From there, we can send a second force to the wall with the supplies we've mustered." He looked around, meeting each gaze. "We will not cower, but nor will we act rashly." Men nodded in agreement. The notion of returning to the seat of House Stark, a castle far more defensible than Serwin, made sense. They would take advantage of the natural springs that kept Winterfell warm, the granaries that could feed an army if needed. Banners would be called. The great John Umber, the Karstarks, the Boltons, though many-eyed mention of House Bolton with unease, would be summoned. The entire North must unite under one banner to face the White Walkers. Ned turned to Robb, gaze softening momentarily. "You did what you had to do," he said. "You showed courage." Then he turned to Jon. "And you, my boy." He gently gripped Jon's shoulder. "You fought bravely, I hear. I wish there had been no need. This is a terrible burden to place on children." Jon swallowed, unsure of what to say. He felt relief that Ned was not angry with him, yet a lump of emotion stuck in his throat. The horrors he had seen were not something a child should bear, yet that was the reality. He gave a small nod, eyes downcast. Their combined host now traveled back to Winterfell. As they approached the castle, the banners of House Stark, gray direwolf on a white field, fluttered in the harsh wind. Trumpets announced their return. The gates swung wide, revealing the silhouette of Lady Catelyn waiting on the battlements, flanked by Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. Ned rode in at the head of the column, Robb and Jon beside him, though Jon hung back slightly. Around them marched an army of men wearing the sigils of the Manderleys, Glovers, Tallhearts, and other northern houses. Winterfell's courtyard erupted with noise as men dismounted. Stable boys ran to take horses, and families reunited. The entire castle felt the tension of the times, but seeing the force that Ned had brought gave them a fleeting sense of hope. That same afternoon, a war council convened in Winterfell's great hall. The lords who had come with Ned were joined by the local bannermen. The hall, lined with torches, was filled with the low murmur of conversations. Winter still pressed outside, winds swirling snow against the windows. Catelyn Stark stood at Ned's side. Maester Luwin hovered at a small table near the dais. Scrolls of messages from various houses spread before him. Robb was there, representing himself now as almost a man grown, while Jon lingered at the edges, not officially invited but permitted to watch quietly since so many in the castle understood his significance in discovering this threat. Ned stood at the front, a silent hush descending as all eyes turned to him. He spoke of the threat the others posed, summarizing what had happened at Castle Serwin, verifying the sightings beyond the wall, the rising number of whites. He voiced no doubts, only a call to arms. "The dead walk in the north," he said, his voice resonating in the hush. "The White Walkers, the others of ancient legend, have returned. We can either unite and stand against them, or we can be swept away by a tide of ice and death." An uneasy stirring passed through the lords. Some had come prepared for this eventuality, having heard the rumors. Others still clung to skepticism, wanting more proof. But the evidence was too strong to deny. Survivors from Serwin bore personal witness. Rangers from the Night's Watch had testified. Men in the hall muttered prayers to the old gods and the new. The last vestiges of doubt began to crumble. One of them, Lord Manderley, a stout man with thick white whiskers, stepped forward. "I will stand with House Stark. White Harbor's fleet is at your disposal, my lord. But we'll need time to gather supplies, to prepare the city's defenses." He gave a grave nod. Galbart Glover, his brow lined with worry, agreed. "Deepwood Mott can send men too, but the roads are difficult this time of year. We must hurry before the snows worsen." Roose Bolton spoke as well, though in his soft, chilling voice, which unsettled many. "House Bolton will contribute men, but let us be certain we coordinate effectively. My men won't be wasted in fruitless skirmishes." There was a tension in the hall at his words, but Ned only nodded curtly. He might not trust Roose Bolton entirely, but the North needed every sword. Other houses followed suit. Plans were laid. Messages would be sent to the Umbers, the Karstarks, the Glovers, and every lesser house, demanding men and provisions. Winterfell would become the stronghold and heart of this alliance, a new seat of war in the face of an unimaginable threat. Meanwhile, Ned would dispatch a large contingent north to reinforce the Night's Watch. The newly arrived men were tired and had limited gear, so it might take a few days to ready them, but time was of the essence. While this planning went on, Jon stood in the background, an unusual heaviness in his chest. It was both terrifying and strangely validating to see that the entire North was responding to what he had discovered. In some sense, it felt like his fate had become intertwined with that of the realm. Yet all he could think of were the lifeless eyes of the Whites at Castle Serwin. How many more would die if they could not stop the others? Over the next few days, Winterfell buzzed with urgent activity. Blacksmiths toiled at forges, hammering steel into swords, spears, and arrowheads. Maids and stewards rushed to inventory the granaries, measure out barley, oats, salted meats, any provisions that could feed an army for an extended campaign. Messengers galloped in and out of the gates, bearing Ned's summons across the snowy roads. Men trained in the courtyard from sunrise to sunset. Even the squires wore determined faces. Ned, meanwhile, drafted new letters to King Robert Baratheon in the south. It was not the first time he had attempted to warn the capital. Previously, those warnings had been met with polite skepticism or political excuses. Ned hoped that the evidence of multiple undead attacks might force the Iron Throne to act. But King Robert was preoccupied with keeping the realm's noble houses in line, dealing with the Lannisters, the Tullis, the Tyrells, and so on. With winter approaching, many in the south simply did not believe a horde of ice demons posed a genuine threat. Or if they believed, they did not see it as their immediate concern. Ned pressed quill to parchment with a heavy heart, writing more forcefully. If the king would not send men, the north might stand alone. And if the north fell, would the south be next? In that swirl of preparations, Jon found himself training more diligently than ever. He and Robb worked with wooden swords, guided by Ser Roderick or other veteran men-at-arms. Theon joined in, sometimes sneering when Jon made a mistake, but occasionally giving genuinely helpful tips. Ghost observed with intense red eyes, tail swishing. At night, Jon found it difficult to rest, haunted by images of the White Walkers. Sometimes he would awaken, certain he heard them whispering his name in the wind. But it was only the lonely moan of winter through the towers. One evening, Jon was summoned to the Godswood by Ned himself. Confused but obedient, Jon slipped through the castle, trudging past the weirwood's white trunk into the heart of the ancient grove. There, he found Ned kneeling before the carved face, candles flickering in the wind, their flames dancing. Snow drifted softly around them, collecting on the roots of the old tree. Jon hesitated, uncertain. Ned looked up, motioned him forward. Jon knelt beside him. The hush of the gods would felt almost sacred. Ned spoke, voice low. "Jon, I have been thinking of the burdens you carry and of the horrors you saw. I have prayed to the old gods for guidance." He paused, exhaling a visible breath into the cold air. "I am sorry to place such a weight on your shoulders. If not for your discovery, we might be blind to this threat, but I know it has haunted you. You are so young." John's throat felt tight. "I only did I didn't mean to bring them, I didn't—" Ned's hand closed gently over his. "Shoo, of course you didn't. You only saw what was truly there, and you spoke the truth, even though many might have doubted you. That took courage." Ned's voice trembled slightly. "Your mother, your birth mother. She would have been proud. I am proud." Tears pricked the corners of John's eyes. Such rare words of acceptance from Ned meant everything. For a moment, all the swirling chaos of the White Walkers and Whites receded, replaced by the warmth of that paternal acknowledgement. Ned continued, his gaze distant. "When this threat is dealt with, if we can drive them back beyond the wall, I promise you that I will see to it your place in this family is—" He broke off, seeming to struggle with the words. John's breath caught. "I can't say more now, but know this, you are important to me, John. Important to the North as well, it seems." He offered a faint, sad smile. John nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He felt a swirl of confusion, longing, gratitude, and the ever-present fear of the White Walkers. He tried to commit the moment to memory. Kneeling with Ned in the hush of the godswood, candle flames reflecting off the carved weirwood face, snow drifting around them like silent watchers. In the days that followed, lords began arriving at Winterfell, one banner after another emerging through the swirling snow. Karstarks with their sunburst sigil, the Umbers with the giant, Manderly knights wearing green and white, Glovers, Tall Hearts, Flints, and even the eerie men of House Bolton. The courtyard became a mass of tents, wagons, and soldiers. Fires burned day and night, sending columns of smoke into the wintry sky. The great hall was filled nightly with men taking meals, discussing strategy, forging alliances. Ned spent hours locked in council, finalizing plans with his key commanders. John, along with Robb, sat in on some of the sessions, though they were not always actively involved. They listened quietly. Some lords were confident that a well-placed army, with enough archers and steel, could hold off any undead horde. Others argued for more cunning solutions, spreading lamp oil and setting large fires, or luring the Whites into traps. A few insisted that dragonglass must be mass-produced, that it was the only sure defense against White Walkers. But the North's obsidian supplies were limited, and blacksmiths could not simply forge more from thin air. From time to time, a shadow fell upon the gathering as the men recalled that they had no guarantee of the White Walkers' numbers. If thousands of them marched, an equally large host would be needed to stand a chance. Then came a raven from the Night's Watch. The situation was dire. Whites roamed as far as the shadow of the wall, and though the Watch tried to keep them at bay, each incursion inflicted more losses. The letter said plainly, "We beg the North to send immediate support, or the wall may be breached." Ned read it aloud to the assembled lords, the tension in the room so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Immediately, the debate began anew. Some demanded they march at once to aid the Watch. Others urged caution, citing the risk of leaving Winterfell undefended. Lords argued back and forth, voices rising. Ned finally called for order. "We will not abandon the Watch. We will send a strong contingent north immediately, led by a trusted commander. The rest of our forces will follow once we secure the Heartlands. The White Walkers may be trying to divide us, forcing us to split our strength. But we have no choice. The Watch cannot hold alone." Silence followed, a shared realization that the tasks ahead were monumental. The meeting broke up so each lord could prepare his men. Outside, the snow began to fall in heavier flakes, as if the land itself mourned what might come. That afternoon, Ned summoned Ser Roderick Castle and several other experienced knights, preparing them to lead a force of 200 men north to aid the Watch. Supplies were packed, obsidian arrowheads distributed as best they could. The men who had seen the Whites at Castle Serwin volunteered eagerly, vowing to settle the score. Robb too wished to go. He wanted to lead, to prove himself, but Ned refused. "I need you here at my side," Ned said. "We will face our own battles soon enough." Robb protested, eyes flashing, but ultimately acquiesced. Jon stood silently, torn between relief and guilt. He himself was not considered for the northern contingent. He tried to quell the longing, the sense of impotence. Meanwhile, more ravens flew, carrying word of the looming threat to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. Ned sent pleas to King Robert, to Stannis Baratheon at Dragonstone, even to the Vale, where Ned's sister-in-law Lisa ruled as regent for her young son. But the realm was riven with politics. The Lannisters in the west might not respond to a Stark call. The Tyrells in Highgarden were far removed from the northern border. Perhaps they would only move if the threat was proven beyond doubt. In a rare moment, Ned confided in Catelyn that he feared the realm would remain divided until it was too late. She laid a hand on his arm, offering what comfort she could. Their relationship had been strained by Jon's presence, by the burdens of rule. But in these dire times, they found a renewed unity, a shared purpose to protect their children and their people. The day the Northern Relief Force departed was cold and gray. Ser Roderick led them out the gates, 200 strong, banners snapping in the wind. The men marched with grim resolve, knowing they went to face an enemy from nightmares. Some might never return, but each man carried with him the fierce pride of the North, the understanding that if they faltered, the rest of the realm might soon fall. Ned stood upon the walls, watching them go. Robb stood beside him, shoulders tense. Jon lingered nearby, Ghost at his side, the direwolf's ears twitching at the swirl of new scents. An unspoken question hung in the frigid air. Would their sacrifice be enough? In the weeks that followed, the Great Hall of Winterfell saw many more councils of war. Lords from across the north arrived with their levies. More than 1,000 men crowded within and outside the castle, and that number grew daily. They brought their own accounts. Sightings of undead in remote forests, entire villages abandoned overnight. On a positive note, some also brought wagons loaded with grain, salted fish, winter vegetables, or livestock. The castle stores began to swell, though the demands of feeding so many also increased. During this time, Eddard Stark's presence at Winterfell was a steadying influence. His calm leadership held the alliances together, even when old rivalries threatened. The lords saw him as the moral center, recalling that he had fought bravely in Robert's rebellion, that he was honorable to a fault. If any man could unite the North, it was Ned Stark. Yet Ned himself suffered sleepless nights, haunted by the knowledge that an inhuman enemy threatened them all. He knew that soon they would be forced to march. Winterfell could not hold the entire North. Once enough forces had assembled, they would have to engage the others directly, or risk letting them pick off each holdfast one by one, as they had done with Castle Serwin. Whispers spread among the men that the White Walkers commanded not just the Whites, but the bitter cold itself. A supernatural winter advanced with them, turning day to twilight and night to endless darkness. Some recalled old legends of the long night, when the sun hid its face for a generation, and the others nearly wiped out humanity. That memory sparked fear in every heart. And Jon Snow, the boy who first encountered these icy fiends, felt that fear most keenly. Each day he trained harder, pushing himself until his arms ached. He sought out older soldiers for swordplay lessons, asking how one fights an enemy that doesn't feel pain. Some told him to aim for the head, to use fire. Others repeated that old rumor about dragonglass or Valyrian steel. There were only a handful of Valyrian steel blades in the entire North, Ned's own ice being one of them, but it was a great sword meant for ceremonial use, too large for typical combat. Jon listened to each piece of advice, the seriousness in his young eyes drawing respect from even hardened warriors. One evening, after a long day of martial exercises, Jon paused in the courtyard. The sky glowed with the orange of a dying sun. He felt the weight of memory pressing down on him, recalling how carefree life had been just a year ago, before that fateful night in the woods. He spotted Theon Greyjoy leaning against a barrel, idly tossing a dagger in the air and catching it by the hilt. Their eyes met, Theon raised an eyebrow. "You've come a long way since I first saw you with a sword, Snow," he remarked. There was a faint edge of respect in his tone. Not bad for a bastard brat. Jon tensed, uncertain if Theon was mocking him. But the older boy's face seemed sincere enough, if somewhat patronizing. "If I'm to fight the others, I need to be better," Jon muttered. Theon nodded, stowing the dagger. For a moment, there was a surprising camaraderie in the air, as if both recognized that the petty barbs of youth were overshadowed by the threat they now faced. On the morrow, lords and their retinues continued arriving. The courtyard bustled. Among the new arrivals was Meege Mormont from Bear Island, accompanied by a handful of fierce shield maidens. They brought word of savage fighting near the coast, strange undead beasts washing ashore from the sea of ice. Meege recounted how her warriors destroyed them with flaming arrows. The men muttered that the White Walkers might be testing every corner of the north. Another set of ravens arrived from the Night's Watch, telling of sporadic skirmishes with whites in the forests beyond the wall. The watch had lost more men, including a ranger who had served for 20 years. But Ser Roderick's contingent had finally reached Castle Black, bolstering the garrison. Morale had improved, though the battles still raged in pockets of the northern wilderness. The main army of White Walkers had not yet appeared in force, an ominous sign that they were biding their time. And so the stage was set for a conflict that would test the mettle of House Stark, the unity of the North, and the resolve of the entire realm. Jon Snow, once just a boy overshadowed by his legitimate siblings, now stood at the intersection of fate and fear. He felt the burden of his discovery pressing down as heavily as the winter sky. Yet in that burden lay a strange purpose. He had found the truth, spoken of it, and now the North was rallying to fight back. Every time Ned gazed at him with quiet pride, every time Robb clapped him on the shoulder after a sparring match, Jon felt a flicker of hope that perhaps he did belong, that he was, in some way, part of this family, this kingdom. But looming beyond the walls, in the forests, by the lakes, even in the shadows of the villages, the White Walkers stirred. Their purpose was unknown, their numbers unclear, but each time a white rose, each time the hush of unnatural cold fell upon the land, the menace grew. The day would soon come when all the fires of Winterfell, all the swords and spears of the assembled North, would stand against that icy legion in a battle none living had ever thought to see. And in that hour, Jon Snow's first glimpse of the Walkers, those tall, pale figures in the forest, would be burned forever into the hearts of the North. For better or worse, the shape of the war to come had been cast. Ned Stark did not pretend to be certain of victory. He had no illusions, but he stood resolute as his ancestors had before him, as the line of Stark always had when winter fell. Watching over the battlements, he saw the courtyards bustling with the North's gathering strength. He saw his own children, and the boy he'd raised as a son, learning to hold steel against nightmares. The memory of those bright blue eyes from his youth, the stories old Nen once told him, lingered. A child discovering White Walkers had forced him into action far sooner than he might have otherwise. Perhaps that was a boon, giving the North precious time. Or perhaps it was only a fraction of what they truly needed. In the hush of night, Ned sometimes stood by the weirwood tree, the moonlight catching streaks of frost in his hair. He prayed for guidance and for the living to prevail. And far beyond Winterfell's walls, in the endless expanse of white, the others moved, silently, inevitably, as if they too listened for the beat of a distant drum. The conflict was coming, a storm of ice and darkness. The North made ready, and Jon Snow, who had once ventured beyond Winterfell's walls in a moment of reckless curiosity, was at the center of it all, a child no longer, forced to become a soldier in a war of the old gods and the new. The night was dark, and soon it would grow darker still, but the fires of the North had been lit, and the last best hope of the living was that those fires would burn bright enough to hold back the coming cold. Maester Luwin's quill scratched across the parchment in hurried strokes, drafting yet another letter to King Robert. Night had draped Winterfell in a dark shroud, and only a few torches illuminated the small council chamber where he sat. A bowl of cooling broth lay untouched by his side. He sighed, dipped his quill again, and glanced over his shoulder. Lord Stark had asked him to send a fresh missive south within the hour, one detailing not just the rumors of whites and White Walkers but the concrete evidence of the fall of Castle Serwin and the testimony of dozens of lords and small folk alike. If Robert Baratheon had any lingering doubts, this final letter, accompanied by a sliver of dragonglass arrowhead, might persuade him to send reinforcements north. Yet Maester Luwin suspected that politics and distance and a southern disbelief in old nightmares would continue to hamper any real help. He finished the letter with a flourish, sanded it, then read it over by candlelight. There was an urgency in every line. When he was satisfied, he blew gently on the ink to ensure it was dry, then folded the parchment and dripped hot wax to seal it with the dire wolf of House Stark. With the letter in hand, he crossed the dim corridors and made his way to the rookery. The ravens rustled at his approach. They were as agitated by the creeping dread as any living creatures might be. Luwin found a sturdy black bird, one of their best flyers, and bound the missive to its leg. The raven croaked, half lifting its wings. He carried it to the opening in the stone wall, the cold wind rushing in, and released it into the night. The bird vanished against the moonlit sky. Down in Winterfell's courtyard, troops drilled even at the late hour. The flicker of torchlight revealed men practicing with shields, swords, and spears. Glover men from Deepwood Motte clashed wooden weapons with umbers from last hearth, each side trying to toughen the other. Smoke curled from braziers placed around the yard to keep the warriors from freezing. The distant clang of steel on steel echoed through the castle, a restless sound that rarely ceased these days. The North was mobilizing faster than anyone could recall in recent generations. Usually, it took months for banners to gather in a single place, but the growing threat of the others had forced them all to ride with haste, often through snow-choked passes. Word spread that thousands more men were on their way. The tension around Winterfell was palpable. Men and women were fearful, but also grimly determined. Eddard Stark stood upon the ramparts, gazing down at the courtyard below. Catelyn had retired to bed but had lingered anxiously by his side earlier. Now, the ramparts were quiet except for a handful of guards who paced the walls, lanterns bobbing in the gloom. Ned's breath fogged before him, drifting away into the still air. He looked up at the stars, brilliant in the clear winter sky, and thought of the Godswood and the words he had shared with Jon. He felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing on him from all sides. It was not only the threat of the others, but the uncertain politics of the southern realm. More than once, he'd thought to ride for King's Landing himself, to stand before Robert and demand an army in the name of an old friendship. But the North needed him here. He could not abandon his seat, not with White Walkers prowling just leagues away. He glanced to his left and saw Robb standing in the shadows of a merlin. The boy had a new seriousness about him since Castle Serwin, as if one bloody confrontation had aged him by years. "Robb," Ned said softly, beckoning. Robb came forward, glancing out over the battlements. The torchlight below turned his hair coppery. "It grows colder by the day, and soon the roads might be impassable." Robb nodded, jaw set. "We're gathering more men, father. We have to push back before the snow buries everything. Or the White Walkers do." Ned let out a slow breath, seeing his own resolve reflected in his son's eyes. "We will. Soon. We're organizing supply lines, mustering a force large enough to hold Winterfell but also strong enough to fight in open field if need be. Until then, we keep a watchful eye." Robb wanted to say more. Ned could sense the questions swirling within him, but they stood in silence for a few moments, letting the cold speak for them. At last, Ned placed a hand on Robb's shoulder, a gentle weight. "Thank you for what you did at Serwin. You led men. You brought them back." Robb only dipped his head in acknowledgement, and together they walked back down the stone steps into the yard. They passed the wide-open ground where men swung swords and pikes. Jon Snow was among them, though it was late. The boy had insisted on extra drills, as if he could quell his nightmares by honing his sword arm. Leaning on a tall pine staff was Theon Greyjoy, shouting corrections to Jon's stance, and near them stood a pair of umbers offering rowdy advice. Ghost prowled at the edges of the lantern-lit circle, watching every motion. When John saw Ned and Rob approach, he lowered his wooden practice sword and stepped aside, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was barely 9, small compared to men, but he'd learned how to move deftly in a fight. Ned regarded him with equal parts pride and concern. It was no easy thing to see a child forced into soldier's discipline, yet such times demanded it. "In bed soon, John," Ned said gently. "You'll fight better rested than half dead on your feet." John gave a quick bow. "Yes, my lord." There was a flicker in his dark gray eyes that told Ned the boy might practice just a bit longer anyway. Ned nodded, deciding not to press the matter. Everyone in the castle found their own ways to cope with this slow-burning dread. In the days that followed, more lords arrived with their retinues. The great hall was transformed into a command center, with a huge map of the north pinned to a stout wooden table. Men in leather and fur crowded around, discussing routes, supply caches, where to station outriders. The wind moaned outside, driving flurries of snow across Winterfell's walls. Early one morning, a small party of men reached Winterfell's gates from the east. Their banners showed a flayed man, House Bolton. Roose Bolton had arrived earlier, but these were the rest of his men, led by a lean, fox-faced knight named Harrick. The Bolton riders brought stories of roads blocked by fallen trees, villages where inhabitants vanished leaving behind half-eaten meals. They also brought captive wildlings who told of a hidden camp in The mountains near the Weeping Waterfalls, a place they claimed was haunted by pale demons. Ned listened to their babbling from the dais, his expression dark. It was all further proof, if any were needed, that the others took no single route. They struck wherever men were vulnerable. Maester Luwin tried to compile these accounts into a coherent pattern, but the White Walkers' movements defied easy logic. They seemed to appear in scattered pockets, perhaps testing defenses or reanimating small groups of corpses. The only consistent fact was that each incursion drove more fear into the hearts of the living, sowing chaos. Night after night, the lords and their commanders debated. Some pressed Ned to commit their growing army at once, to seek out the others and crush them before they could strike again. Others cautioned that the White Walkers might lure them into a trap. Better to remain at Winterfell and fortify, letting the scattered outriders handle smaller threats. There were countless arguments, ranging from older knights who reminded everyone that men had triumphed once during the long night, to younger ones wanting glory in battle. But Ned, mindful that an army too large to feed would starve in the field, wrestled with the logistics of moving so many men in midwinter. Supplies, roads, and the cunning of an inhuman enemy, these weighed heavily on his decisions. John, though not officially part of these councils, caught snippets of their conversations whenever he was sent on errands for Maester Luwin or lingered with Robb. The tension in the great hall seeped into his dreams each night, fueling nightmares of a pale figure with a crown of ice. Sometimes he jolted awake, convinced he felt that gaze upon him, that silent, soul-freezing stare. He would roll over, heart hammering, to see Ghost watching him in the moonlight, ears alert as though sensing the shape of John's terror. He was not the only one haunted. Tormund Talltalker, a wildling who had deserted the far north and stumbled south, told the watchman a chilling tale. Entire villages of free folk had bent the knee to some unknown force, or else died. The White Walkers raised the corpses of those they slew. Tormund was older in this timeline, having roamed the haunted forest for decades. He bellowed that the time for half measures was done, that men needed to stand together, wildling, northerner, or kneeler. Roderick Castle listened with a skeptical ear, but Tormund's sincerity was plain enough. The wildling insisted that if the others could gather enough dead, they would unleash a force unstoppable by ordinary steel. Rumors also came from the Night's Watch. Ser Roderick and his men had stiffened the garrison's defenses. Rangers ventured out with dragonglass-dipped arrows. Some rangers returned with gory trophies, severed hands of wights that still twitched unless burnt. Others did not return at all. At Eastwatch by the sea, fishermen claimed to have glimpsed shapes moving across an ice floe. Some men swore that the sea itself was slowly freezing near the shore, allowing the dead to cross. Each new message carried more dread. At length, Ned decided the time had come to march in force. He worried that waiting any longer would only yield more scattered attacks. The question was not if, but when the others would unite into a mass assault. If the North stood idle too long, they might lose holdfasts one by one. With that in mind, the Stark banners were readied. War horns sounded in the courtyard, calling men to form up. The muster stretched over several days. Wagons were loaded with barrels of salt fish, root vegetables, casks of mead, and as many supplies as they could spare. Blacksmiths forged extra spear points, arrowheads, and axe blades. The small supply of obsidian was divided carefully, each lord receiving some to distribute among his most skilled bowmen. The day before the host would depart, Ned brought his family to the Godswood, just as a light snow began to drift from a dull sky. With him were Catelyn, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. Jon lingered behind them, uncertain if this was a moment for him, but Ned gave him a slight nod, beckoning him forward. One by one, they offered prayers. Catelyn prayed to the Seven, as was her custom, while the rest turned to the ancient weirwood, lips moving in silent supplication. Jon watched the red sap tears trail down the carved face, wishing he felt the god's presence. He closed his eyes, letting the hush of the trees fill his mind. In that stillness, he recalled the night he first saw the others. The snapping of branches, the glimmer of pale ice. A shiver coursed through him. When the prayers were done, Ned laid a hand on Jon's shoulder in front of the entire family. Catelyn's expression flickered, but she did not protest. The children looked on quietly, each wrestling with their own fears. Even little Rickon sensed that something vast and dangerous was happening. After a moment, Ned turned and left the Godswood, cloak trailing in the snow. The rest followed, footsteps muffled by the powdery drifts. Dawn broke cold and gray on the day of departure. The walls of Winterfell were lined with families and small folk who had gathered to watch the army set forth. Horns sounded, echoing through the stone courtyards. Horses pawed at the ground, their breath steaming in the crisp air. Banners of every shape and color fluttered. The Wolf of Stark, the Sunburst of Karstark, the Giant of Umber, the Green Hand of Manderley, the Flayed Man of Bolton, the Mailed Fist of Glover, and more. Thousands of men in leather and mail harnessed up, forming long columns that stretched from the gates. Some would remain behind to protect Winterfell. Lord Wyman Manderley had volunteered a contingent of knights to bolster the castle's garrison, alongside older men and younger boys unfit for distant campaigning. Ned led the main force. Robb rode close at his side, stern-faced. Jon, astride a small horse again, found himself in the company of Theon and a handful of squires. He felt dwarfed by the scale of the host around him. Nearby, Meage Mormont marched with her Bear Island women, and Great Jon Umber bellowed orders at his tall bannermen. The swirling snow gave the exodus a surreal air, as if an army of ghosts was gliding forth from Winterfell. Yet there was a grim determination in their eyes. Catelyn, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon watched from atop the walls. Rickon clung to Catelyn's skirts, scanning for Robb's figure in the sea of men, while Arya tried to remain stoic but was plainly upset that she had been told she was too young to accompany them. She stood on her toes, searching for Jon's face, and when she spotted him, she waved fiercely. Jon, turning in the saddle, caught sight of her and raised a hand in return. A fleeting smile touched his lips, overshadowed by the dread he felt about the road ahead. The army's departure stretched throughout the morning as one column after another wended through the gate. By midday, Winterfell's courtyard felt strangely hollow, an echo of the morning bustle. Snow drifted over churned mud and hoof prints. Catelyn's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. She turned away, beckoning the younger children inside. They would have to hold faith that Ned Stark would return with victory rather than heartbreak. The columns advanced slowly. Cold wind bit at the men's exposed skin. The going was tough. The snow was not yet so deep as to stall them, but it was thick enough to exhaust the horses. Scouts rode ahead, checking for signs of wights or White Walkers. Occasionally they discovered battered farmsteads, livestock killed or missing, footprints in the churned snow that led nowhere. Each new finding tightened Ned's expression. They pressed onward to the east, aiming to secure the lands around the King's Road. The plan was to push toward Castle Serwin, refortify it, then scout for any sign of the others to the south and east. Meanwhile, some outriders would sweep north, bridging contact with the Night's Watch to coordinate any upcoming campaign. If, in that process, they found the White Walkers, Ned meant to bring the full might of the assembled North against them. The men marched, pulling supply wagons behind them, carrying the hopes of their families and the entire realm. On the third day, they reached a wide, frozen river that needed fording. The crossing was treacherous. The ice might crack under the weight of so many horses and men. So a portion of the cavalry scouted upstream to find a safer crossing, while foot soldiers tested the thickness with poles. John stood to one side, watching as heavy planks were laid. The noise of men calling, the clank of armor, and the crisp crackle of ice underfoot set his nerves on edge. He remembered hearing that the others could bring a cold so deep that rivers froze in an instant. He wondered if these waters were safe or if the White Walkers lurked somewhere on the other side, silent and waiting. Nightfall forced them to set up camp on the near bank. Fires were lit, tents erected. The bitter wind howled, carrying flurries that lashed at the canvas. Men hunched by the flames, passing around steaming cups of mead or ale to keep warm. John shared a tent with several squires, including Theon, though Theon bristled at the term squire, preferring to say he was a ward of House Stark. They bundled in furs, their breath fogging the tent's interior. The talk that night was subdued, men trading fearful stories of the undead. One older squire insisted he'd heard that if a white bit you, you'd freeze from the inside out and become a white yourself. Another scolded him for repeating superstitions. John found himself half drowsing, hand on Ghost's back. The dire wolf had grown even larger, alarmingly so, yet Ghost remained silent, eyes glowing in the dimness. John wondered if they should be out on watch, scanning for any flicker of movement, but he was still a child by many standards. The grown knights patrolled the perimeter, so he drifted into uneasy dreams until shouts jolted him awake. Somewhere near the back of the camp, a sentry had sounded the alarm. John heard the war horn's low note, felt a jolt of terror. He sprang up, pushing aside the tent flap, stepping into swirling snow. Men rushed about, grabbing weapons, peering into the darkness. Theon stumbled out behind him, half-laced boots crunching on the frosty ground. John saw torches converging on the edge of camp. A second horn blast echoed, and men near John muttered, "Whites!" Ghost let out a low growl and bounded ahead. John sprinted after the dire wolf, ignoring the sting of the cold. Heart hammering, he reached the ring of men at the perimeter. Their torches illuminated a grisly scene. A pair of half-frozen corpses slumped in the snow, recognizable from scraps of clothing as some of the outriders. They had been slain, throats torn open. No sign of a living attacker. Men whispered that the kill was too fresh, no more than an hour old, yet no one had heard a struggle. Ned arrived, pushing through the throng, sword belted over a fur-lined cloak. He knelt to inspect the bodies, expression grim. Robb stood behind him, face pale, as Roderick Castle examined footprints on the snow's surface. They found marks that resembled bare feet, not quite human, leading away to the trees. A deep hush settled, broken only by the crackle of torches. Sir Roderick rose, teeth gritted. "We should track them, my lord, before they get away." But Ned shook his head. "Not in the dark. It's too dangerous. They could be luring us out. We'll fortify the camp, double the watch, and wait for first light. Then we track." He glanced at the bodies again, a shadow crossing his face. John saw him close his eyes briefly, as if wrestling with the horror that had claimed two more of his men. They built a large pyre for the two outriders. The flickering flames drew men from all over camp, watchers holding torches, somber as the bodies were consumed. John pressed in close, swallowing the knot in his throat. He realized that the undead or their masters had been close, possibly within bowshot. The tension was immediate, heavy. Every man slept that night with his sword drawn, those who managed to sleep at all. John lay awake, hearing Ghost occasionally issue a soft rumbling growl. Dawn came sluggishly, the sky a pallid gray. Ned organized a hunting party of skilled trackers, including some Karstark men rumored to be adept at tracing footprints in winter terrain. Robb begged to join them, but Ned told him his place was with the main body of the army. "You must learn to command from the center, Robb," he said quietly. Robb looked disappointed but obeyed. Ned scanned the crowd until he spotted John among the watchers, the boy's eyes silently pleading. After a moment's hesitation, Ned allowed him to come, reasoning that Ghost's keen senses might be useful. Theon, brash as ever, invited himself along. They set out from camp with a dozen men. The footprints leading away from the site were faint after a night of drifting snow. Still, the trackers pressed on. Ghost prowled at the front, nose to the ground, while Ned rode behind on a sturdy Garen, scanning the tree line. John tried to keep up, the cold biting his cheeks. The party advanced deeper into the woods. The air was silent. No birds chirped, no animals scurried. It was as though the forest held its breath. They followed the trail for an hour, occasionally losing it amidst tangles of brush. The footprints seemed aimless or perhaps deliberately misleading. Twice, they came upon half-melted lumps that proved to be the remains of small animals, killed and left in the snow. Each time, Ghost paused, sniffed, then continued. At last, they reached a clearing of withered grass dusted with snow. The footprints ended abruptly, vanishing on a patch of ice. The Karstark trackers exchanged frustrated glances. One approached the patch, carefully touching it with his spear. The ice was oddly slick, clearer than natural frost, as though a freezing hand had laid it down. Ghost sniffed it, then bared his teeth, whining. Ned surveyed the clearing, but there was no sign of the killer. No whites, no towering shape of ice and bone. Just that unnatural spot and the hush of the surrounding woods. One of the Karstarks muttered that the others were toying with them, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. Theon spat curses under his breath. John stared at the ice patch, recalling that first night in the forest so long ago, when the mere presence of a White Walker had made the air colder. He glanced at Ned, saw the tension in his face. They searched the area more thoroughly, then withdrew, having gleaned no more clues. The only evidence was that the others or their whites had come startlingly close to their camp, striking swiftly, retreating just as fast. By mid-morning, the hunting party was back. Robb listened grimly to their report, hands tightening on the reins of his horse. If the White Walkers intended to harry them at every turn, the march would be grueling. Yet the alternative, hunkering down, promised no better results. The host resumed its advance across the river that day, establishing a stronger defensive perimeter each night. Men took turns on guard duty, each shift lasting only a few hours so that no one would drift off from exhaustion. Ned Stark insisted upon patrolling the perimeter himself at least once a night, checking each guard post. He spoke quietly to the men, reminding them they served a vital role, that every watchful eye helped keep the others at bay. Some men found courage in Ned's presence. Others found it in Mead, but all recognized that unwavering vigilance was their only shield against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the dark. That caution proved wise. On the fifth night, as they approached the outskirts of Castle Serwin, a group of whites launched a sudden raid against the rearguard. The alarm went up quickly, and swords flashed in torchlight. John heard the screaming from his spot nearer the vanguard, hopped onto a horse, and sped back along the column, heart pounding. Ghost loped beside him. By the time he reached the rearmost wagons, the men had formed a circle, pikes bristling outwards. Whites, their pale eyes glowing, clawed at the defenders. At least one was dressed in rags that bore the Serwin sigil. Another had the half-decayed face of a woman, her hair a tangled mat of ice and filth. They lunged with frenzied strength. Robb arrived too, sword in hand, urging men to close ranks. Fire arrows were loosed from the bowmen, some missing in the confusion, but enough found their targets. Whites burst into flames, limbs still flailing. Warriors thrust spears into torsos, but the undead only hissed and kept coming until heads were removed or flames consumed their remains. The entire scene was a blur of shouting, steel on bone, and the nauseating stench of burning flesh. John slid off his horse, rushing forward with his sword. A wight lunged at him, a rotting man missing one arm. John barely parried, stumbling in the snow. Ghost leapt, teeth sinking into the wight's leg, dragging it to the ground. John scrambled to his feet, heart racing, swung his sword in a desperate arc, and struck the creature's neck. The blade bit into frozen flesh but did not sever cleanly. The wight thrashed. Bloodless fluids leaked from its severed veins. John gagged, mustered his strength, and hacked again. At last, the head came free. The limbs jerked spastically, but the wight was effectively ended. When the fray subsided, a half-dozen men lay dead or dying, some with terrible wounds that looked half-frozen around the edges. Several wights still twitched on the ground, missing limbs, until the men tossed them onto a hastily made fire. As the bodies crackled, a hush spread over the survivors. The attack had come swiftly from the darkness, the wights' approach masked by howling wind and swirling snow. It confirmed that the White Walkers or their minions lurked close, shadowing the army. Rob stood with sword in hand, breathing heavily. Blood spattered his cloak. When Ned arrived to see the aftermath, his face was grave. "Bury our men with honors," he commanded softly. "Burn the wights." The soldiers did as ordered, though many muttered dark prayers as they shoveled snow and built taller pyres. John was left trembling, arms aching, eyes stinging with sweat and tears. He had killed a wight, a human body, once alive. The horrors of it overwhelmed him. Even Ghost seemed uneasy, pacing in circles, muzzle stained with vile fluids. They pressed on more cautiously after that. The next day, Castle Serwin loomed, its walls battered and half repaired from the earlier attack. Ned had hoped to station a small garrison there, to use it as a base of operations. But upon arrival, the men found the place in worse condition than anticipated. The gates remained splintered, the courtyard half filled with snowdrifts. The White Walkers' assault had left deep scars. Some local survivors, mostly old or injured folk who hadn't managed to flee, sheltered inside the keep's kitchen, half-starved. They stumbled out, relieved to see the Stark banners. Ned ordered them fed and clothed, yet the holdfast was not secure. Collapsed sections of walls needed rebuilding before the castle could be truly defensible. This would require time, manpower, and resources. Some lords grumbled that holding Castle Serwin was an unnecessary burden. Others argued that leaving it vacant would allow wights to infest it again. In the end, Ned decided to garrison it with a moderate force under the command of Harrion Karstark. Harrion's men had carpenters among them who could begin makeshift repairs, and the presence of a Stark bannerman might at least keep the corridors safe for survivors trickling in from the surrounding countryside. Having thus split off some of their strength, Ned's main force pressed onward. The next part of the plan was to proceed south, ensuring that the White Walkers were not skulking in the Wolf's Wood or creeping along the banks of the White Knife. As days blurred together, the men endured more skirmishes with scattered wights, but no direct confrontation with the others themselves. It was as if the White Walkers teased them with glimpses of undead, then vanished back into the icy wilderness. Tension mounted with each passing day. Supplies gradually diminished. Sledges of foraged wood and game supplemented rations, but it was not easy to feed thousands on the march. Sometimes, around the campfires, men whispered that the others must be massing to the far north, preparing a great onslaught. Others suggested the others were fewer in number than feared, reliant on small-scale terror tactics. No one knew for certain. John hovered on the edges of these conversations, hearing them but saying little. He was too overwhelmed, still absorbing each day's brush with death, each moment of horror. More than once, he tried to speak with Ned, to ask what would happen if the others truly fielded an army. Ned would only murmur that men had faced them once before, and in that ancient time men prevailed, though at a terrible cost. There was no promise it would be the same now. One afternoon, after a weary march, the army halted at a broad clearing in the midst of the Wolf's Wood. Trees soared on every side, branches laden with snow. Ned ordered them to make camp. Scouts ventured ahead to see if the roads were passable. John, half shivering in the cold, helped the others clear a space for fires. Theon was cursing at a stubborn bit of flint that refused to spark. Rob was busy assisting the supply train, ensuring the wagons were positioned well. Ghost trotted around the perimeter, sniffing. Suddenly, the dire wolf stiffened, hackles rising. John, noticing, dropped the bundle of wood he was carrying. "Ghost," he whispered. The wolf's posture spoke volumes. Something was wrong. John scanned the nearby trees but saw only falling snow. Then he heard it. A faint, eerie wail that made his skin crawl. It was no animal sound he recognized, nor the wind through the branches. It was distant but unmistakably something alive or undead. John dashed to find Rob and Ned. Within moments, the camp was alert. Men armed themselves, forming ranks around the wagons. The wailing came again, slightly closer. A hush fell, each man bracing for an attack. Ghost bared his teeth. Then silence. Long minutes passed. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Ned and Rob joined the perimeter, scanning the treeline. Nothing moved. No white lurched from behind the trunks. The tension grew unbearable. Then, without warning, a voice shouted from the far side of camp. Men turned to see a figure stumbling through the snow, waving a limp standard of some sort. Archers notched arrows immediately, waiting for Ned's command. As the figure drew closer, it became apparent that he was alone, caked in frost, half dead on his feet. He wore black rags, Night's Watch rags. "Hold!" Ned called out. The archers relaxed, though their eyes remained wary. The man collapsed into the arms of a Karstark soldier, gasping. His face was gaunt, lips blue with cold. They rushed him to a fire, stripped off his ice-encrusted gloves. In halting gasps, the man spoke his name, Daniel. A ranger from Eastwatch, he'd been dispatched to find the Stark host. He sputtered that the wall was under siege, not by a full army, but by relentless waves of whites and scattered White Walkers who picked off defenders in the black of night. Word had spread that the Night's Watch was near to breaking. "We cannot hold them forever," he croaked, eyes wild. "Fewer men on the wall each day. We see them at dusk. They pick us off. If help does not come soon, gods." Ned knelt, listening, expression taut. "Where is Ser Roderick?" he asked, recalling that he had sent Ser Roderick's contingent to bolster the watch weeks ago. Daniel coughed, lips cracking. "They fought bravely, lost many men. Ser Roderick, I do not know. Last I saw, he was leading a sortie east of Castle Black. But that was days past." The ranger grimaced, tears freezing on his cheeks. They might have been overrun. A profound stillness gripped the men around the fire. Rob's face hardened with determination. John felt his stomach twist. Ser Roderick had been like a teacher, a kindly yet stern mentor who had taught him to handle a sword properly. The possibility of his loss hung heavy in the air, but it was overshadowed by the realization that the wall, their final bulwark, was crumbling. Ned rose to his feet. "We march north," he declared. "At once." Lord Bolton objected, stepping forward with a cold sneer. "But my lord, we are half out of provisions. We've marched in circles, faced whites at every turn. If we go north now, with the roads in this state..." Ned spun on him, eyes fierce, and the sight silenced Roose Bolton at once. "We cannot let the Night's Watch fall. The entire north would be exposed." He looked around at the assembled lords. "Even if the others strike us as we travel, we must attempt it. Fall in or fall away. But I go." One by one, the other lords voiced their agreement. The cold logic was inescapable. If the others broke through the wall in force, none of the holdfasts behind it would matter. They would be devoured by a tide of the dead. Some men clenched their fists, others murmured a vow to the old gods. But all recognized that the final stand had to be made at the wall, or else not at all. That night, the Stark host turned around, forging a new path toward the King's Road that ran north. It was a grueling process. The forests were dense, the snow thick. Wagons got stuck, horses slipped. Men muttered that they had wasted days traveling south only to backtrack. But none could have anticipated the sudden news from the ranger. Morale wavered, battered by exhaustion and the fear that they were already too late. John endured the trek in a sullen numbness. Each day, the pale winter sun offered little warmth, and each night the howling wind kept men awake, fearing another white attack. He tried to focus on small tasks, caring for his horse, gathering wood for fires, drilling with the sword. Ghost remained close, fur bristling at every rustle of wind through branches. Ned and Rob pushed onward at the front, calling daily councils to ensure the column did not splinter. The great lords, some grumbling, continued to follow. Perhaps the most vocal about the change of plans was Lord Bolton, but even he dared not risk open dissent when the entire north seemed on the brink of doom. They reached the main road after a week of difficult marching. By then, the men were half-starved, forced to slaughter some of the pack animals along the way. Ned ordered partial rations distributed from the wagons, saving at least some stores for the battles ahead. The night they set foot on the King's Road, a sense of relief swept over them. Though the road was by no means free of snow, it was better than forging through forest. Scouts rode ahead, verifying that the path to Castle Black was somewhat passable. But with that relief came fresh tension. The King's Road was open ground. If the others had mustered a sizable force, they could converge on the column out in the open. Men built perimeter defenses each evening with sharpened stakes, placed watchers at every vantage point, ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of creeping whites. Firelight flickered across sleepless faces. John lay awake, clutching his cloak tight against the cold, listening to the shift of men on guard and the occasional distant scream of some wild creature. Or was it something else? A few days later, at dusk, the forward scouts spotted torches on the horizon. Another army approached from the north. At once, tension rippled through Ned's host. Were they whites bearing torches? A trick? The scouts soon returned, breathless, reporting that it appeared to be men of the Night's Watch and some northern bannermen. Word was relayed back through the column, relieving many hearts. Ned rode out with Rob and a contingent of lords to meet the newcomers. The two forces converged on the King's Road, torches shining in the twilight. At their head was none other than Sir Roderick Castle, gaunt, one arm in a sling. Men cheered at the sight of him. Beside him rode Jeor Mormont, the old bear himself, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, wrapped in black furs. Their ranks included an exhausted mix of black brothers, stark bannermen, and free folk who had chosen to fight under the Watch's banner rather than face the others alone. Ned dismounted, took 3 steps, and clasped Sir Roderick's free hand. "You live?" Ned said softly, relief plain in his voice. Then he turned to the Lord Commander, nodding with deep respect. "My friend, I'm glad you made it. We heard dire rumors." "They're all true," Jeor Mormont rumbled. His voice carried the weight of too many losses. The old knight's eyes flitted over the battered state of Ned's men, gleaning how difficult their journey had been. "The whites come in waves, each night heavier than the last. We've lost too many rangers. The wall holds for now, but if the others gather in earnest, we cannot stand alone." Ned led them to a hastily assembled tent where they could speak in private. Rob, John, Roderick, Theon, and a few other key lords joined them around a single brazier that sputtered feebly. Jeor Mormont explained the precarious state of the Night's Watch in detail. Eastwatch reported that the coast grew increasingly iced over, while Shadow Tower had seen strange shapes moving along the high passes. Castle Black had turned into a fortress of perpetual vigilance. In the midst of these assaults, they had so few men that they could not mount a significant foray beyond the wall. They were on the defensive, reacting to each new attack as best they could. "We need you at the wall," Jeor said, voice cracking with fatigue. "Not just your men, every man you can muster. If these devils break through the gates, they'll sweep the north before you can blink." Ned nodded. "Then you shall have us." He gestured at the lords in the tent. "We are many, though half-starved and weary. Still, we'll go north at dawn. Perhaps your men can guide us to Castle Black as quickly as possible." Gior allowed himself a small nod of approval. "Your father would have done the same, I'm sure. The Starks always answer the call." His gaze flicked to Jon, the tired lines of his face hinting at curiosity. He'd heard rumors that Jon Snow was a child who had first seen the others. But no words were exchanged on that subject, for the burdens of leadership loomed too large. Plans were made through the night. The combined force would push up the King's Road in a forced march, braving the increasingly harsh weather. The watchers at Castle Black would signal them if the others struck early. With so many thousands of men, some traveling by wagon, speed was limited. Yet Ned resolved to get there as soon as possible. At dawn, the two armies merged, forging one great column that stretched nearly half a mile. Men in black cloaks marched beside northerners wearing leathers, furs, and battered steel. The free folk who had joined the watch glowered suspiciously at the kneelers, while many northern knights eyed the wildlings warily in turn. Yet necessity bound them together. If they failed to cooperate, they would all die in the snows. Jon rode near the front with Robb, Theon, and a few black brothers. Ser Roderick remained close to Ned, conferring about tactics. The old bear marched on foot at times, refusing a horse except when absolutely necessary, setting an example for his men. Overhead, the sky hung leaden, threatening more snow. Frost clung to every branch, every rock. It felt as though they traversed a land of endless winter. On the second day of their northward push, they spotted a thin plume of smoke rising behind the treeline. Scouts went to investigate, returning with grim news. A small hamlet had been attacked. The villagers were either scattered or dead. The men found only a circle of charred remains and that same impossible frost marking the ground. The White Walkers had passed this way, and recently, at night, the temperature dropped to punishing lows. The wind seemed to carry whispers, half-formed words that made the hair on men's necks stand on end. Sentries reported fleeting glimpses of pale figures at the edges of the torchlight. Each time, the camp braced for an attack, but nothing materialized. It was psychological torment. Ned saw it in the hollowed faces of his men. Some began to mutter that the others were hurting them, driving them north to the wall like sheep into a pen. Rumors swirled through the camp, fueling dread. Yet the army pressed on. Day by day, they drew closer to the wall. Finally, after weeks of relentless marching, the vanguard came upon the high ridge from which they could see the colossal structure in the distance. The sight was both awe-inspiring and chilling. The wall rose like a glacier against the horizon, shimmering under a faint winter sun. Great clouds of ravens circled overhead, and shapes moved along the top parapets. The fortress of Castle Black sprawled at its base, a cluster of wooden buildings dwarfed by the sheer magnitude of ice behind it. Jeor Mormont sighed in relief, leading them forward. But as they neared, they saw the wall was battered and chipped in places from repeated assaults. Fires burned in trenches around Castle Black, producing black smoke that drifted across the ice. Guards peered down from the ramparts, their black cloaks stark against the white-blue glare. A horn sounded in welcome, echoing across the snowy plains. The gates to Castle Black swung wide. Ragged cheers erupted among Ned's men. Some had never seen the wall before and gaped at its impossible height. Others simply thanked the gods for reaching their destination alive. Jon felt a surge of strange emotion. This was where he might have gone someday, had he chosen the Night's Watch, except now, at 9 years of age, he was here in the midst of war, not in quiet oath-taking. They trudged inside the castle's courtyard. Tired men dismounted stiffly, leading horses to stables. The Black brothers manning the walls looked worn to the bone, their eyes sunken. Jeor Mormont at once began barking orders to integrate Ned's forces with the Watch's defenses. Tents were erected in every spare corner. The Great Hall was opened to the Northern Lords for urgent conferences. Ned and the Lords quickly realized the scale of the damage. Parts of Castle Black had been scorched or collapsed in recent skirmishes with whites that scaled the wall or found their way through hidden tunnels. The watch was down to half its usual number. Ser Jeremy Ricker had fallen. Maester Eamon tended the wounded day and night, though there was little he could do for many injuries inflicted by unnatural cold. Some men had limbs blackened with frostbite, requiring amputation. The smell of illness and open latrines permeated the corners of the keep. The largest concern was that the others could attack in concentrated force at any moment, especially with so much blood gathering in one place. The watchers on the wall reported seeing more and more shapes moving beyond the vast icy barrier, though whether they were whites or living wildlings, no one could say for sure. The archers manned the battlements day and night, armed with obsidian-tipped arrows, though their supply was sorely limited. That evening, Ned convened a massive war council in the Great Hall. The place was cramped with northern lords, Night's Watch officers, and a handful of free folk representatives. Fires roared in the hearths, providing meager warmth. Jeor Mormont presided beside Ned, a living symbol of the alliance between the Watch and the North. Robb stood at Ned's side, stoic despite his youth. Jon lingered at the edges, keen to hear what was said but mindful of his place. Theon, arms crossed, stood beside him. Discussions went on for hours. The immediate question: how to coordinate the defense of the wall. The Watch's manpower had been decimated. The new arrivals from the north offered a life-saving boost, but there was no guarantee of victory if the others mounted a full-scale invasion. Some proposed a preemptive strike beyond the wall to find and destroy the White Walkers in their own domain. Others argued that the risk was too great, that they would be lost in a deadly maze of frozen forest. The free folk insisted that the others had no single encampment. They drifted like living frost, appearing where they wished, raising whites to do most of their fighting. In the end, Ned ordered a multi-pronged approach. Strengthen the wall's defenses, send out small elite ranger units to gather intelligence, and if feasible, intercept pockets of whites before they grew into unstoppable hordes. The lords debated tactics, such as building more fire traps along the base of the wall, or stationing rotating patrols on top. Every plan hinged on the uncertain factor of the others' movements. The next day saw men of the north climbing the switchback stair to man the wall. Jon ascended with Robb at one point, the climb leaving them breathless in the thin, frigid air. Atop, the view was staggering. An endless expanse of white stretching north, a bleak and lifeless land. Down below, Castle Black was a scattering of black shingles and swarming figures. Robb gazed out, expression tight, as if searching for a silhouette of the enemy. Jon felt the cold seep through him, imagining that somewhere out there, White Walkers glided across the snow, planning their next move. Ghost stood at the edge, staring into the distance, fur bristling in the wind. That very evening, a patrol of Black Brothers and Northern Scouts returned from beyond the wall, battered and bloodied. They carried news of an approaching force of whites in the haunted forest, possibly 100 strong or more. One man swore he had glimpsed a tall figure at their head, pale armor reflecting moonlight. The watchers on the wall had not yet spotted them, hidden as they were in the thick trees, but the patrol insisted they were moving south, perhaps for an assault. The men in the yard who heard this news froze in fear. If 100 whites reached the wall, it would be a formidable onslaught by itself. Never mind if more lay behind them. Ned called for immediate action. Even if it was only a fraction of the rumored horde, better to strike them in the open than let them assault the gate. Jeor Mormont agreed. They formed a volunteer force of rangers and northern warriors to ride out from the gate, meet the whites, and, if possible, lure or drive them into a kill zone. Meej Mormont volunteered to lead with some of her Bear Island women. Ser Roderick insisted on going, despite his wounded arm. Robb stepped forward, too determined to fight. Ned hesitated, wanting to keep his heir safe, but recognized that morale would soar if the young Stark joined the fray. So he relented, on the condition that veteran knights flank Robb and keep watch over him. Jon stood at the foot of the steps, heart pounding, waiting for a chance to speak with Ned. At last he found it. "Let me come, my lord," he said, voice tight. "I've fought whites before. I can help." He braced for refusal. Ned's eyes flicked to Rob, to John, then to Ghost. He seemed torn. At last, with a small sigh, he nodded. "All right, John, but you'll stay close to me." John's spirit soared with mingled terror and relief. He hurried to gather his gear. A sturdy cloak, the best sword he could carry, a dagger of black obsidian that a blacksmith had hurriedly mounted in a crude hilt. Ghost padded behind him. Theon, scowling that he was not invited, cornered Ned and demanded to join as well. Ned allowed it, half smiling at the boy's brashness. So Theon rode out with them, proud as a rooster. When dusk fell, the large party formed up outside Castle Black's main gate. Flames danced on torches, reflecting on steel helms. The wind moaned across the ice. At Ned's signal, they set off, a wedge of riders and a contingent of foot soldiers, heading into the haunted forest beyond the wall. The plan was to intercept the whites, strike hard, then retreat if the White Walkers themselves appeared in force. They pressed through the twisting trails, branches heavy with snow overhead, the ground uneven and slippery. Scouts moved ahead, scanning the darkness. Ghost padded silently through the undergrowth, nose low. John gripped his reins, heart thrumming. Rob rode on his left, Theon on the right. Ned was just ahead, speaking in hushed tones with Ser Roderick and Meej Mormont. The men behind them were a motley mix. Black brothers, northern knights, wildling spearwives, all united by a single cause. The forest grew eerily silent. Even the wind died, as if holding its breath. Now and then, a rider's horse would nicker or a branch would snap underfoot, but otherwise the hush lay thick. John swore he felt eyes on him. Indeed, a chill that went beyond the night air brushed his skin. He glanced at Ghost. The direwolf's posture was tense, tail straight out behind him. Ahead, the scouts halted, raising a hand. The party drew up, men whispering. A gloom-shrouded ravine opened before them, lined with broken stumps and half-dead trees. The scouts pointed. At the bottom of the ravine, faint shapes shuffled in the shadows, moving south. It was the White Band. Their numbers were unclear, maybe 50, maybe 100 or more. Some carried weapons, others just moved with single-minded purpose, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Ned dismounted quietly, gesturing for others to do the same. A plan was made in hushed voices. Half the force would circle around to flank the ravine, setting an ambush, while the rest waited for Ned's signal to charge from the front. They hoped to surprise the undead, hack them apart, then burn the remnants. The Watchers kept an eye for any White Walker. If they spotted that tall, icy figure, they would blow a horn, and the party would withdraw to safer ground. Overconfidence could be lethal. Carefully, men crept into position, stepping around patches of ice, controlling their breathing. John's heart hammered so loudly he thought it might alert the whites. He pressed a hand to his chest, willing himself to stay calm. Theon smirked, as if to mask his own nerves. Rob's knuckles were white on his sword hilt. Ned, behind a trunk, watched the shape of the undead move in the ravine. He waited, then he raised a hand, flicking it forward. The Northmen attacked as one, descending on the whites with torches, swords, and spears. The ravine erupted into chaos. Flames danced, reflecting off twisted faces. Whites hissed, turning with jerky motions to confront the living. Their eyes glowed unnatural blue. Swords chopped through rotting limbs. Axes cleaved skulls. Screams and howls filled the night. John found himself face to face with a skeletal wight wearing the tattered remnants of a Night's Watch cloak. His jaw gaped, snapping at him. John thrust forward with his sword, burying it in the wight's chest, but it hardly slowed. He yanked the blade free, sidestepped a clawed hand. Ghost sprang out of the shadows, bearing the wight down. John swung again, severing the head with a desperate strike. The creature twitched, foulness spurting from its neck. Men with torches rushed around, trying to set whites aflame. The undead flailed, many toppling under the combined assault. Meej Mormont roared like a bear, swinging a heavy mace that shattered 2 white skulls in quick succession. Rob led a group that pinned several whites against a fallen log, hacking them apart. Theon skewered one with his spear, cursing at the stench. Everywhere, there was the reek of rot and the madness of silent, unfeeling enemies that did not beg for mercy. It seemed the living had the advantage, outnumbering and overwhelming the whites with coordinated strikes. Jon felt a flicker of hope. They were winning. Then the horn blew, a single wail that cut through the din like a knife. A lookout's warning. Jon's chest tightened. Somewhere near the north edge of the ravine, a shape drifted between the trees. In the flicker of torchlight, the watchers glimpsed armor that glittered like ice. A tall figure with eyes that burned blue. A White Walker. Panic rippled through the men. The plan had been to withdraw if they spotted a walker, for they knew these beings could freeze a man's blood with a touch, or shatter ordinary steel with their strange swords. But the fighting was thick, men locked in close quarters with whites. It was easier said than done to simply flee. Ned shouted above the tumult, "Fall back! Fall back to the ridge!" He tried to push forward, searching for Rob among the swirling chaos. Ser Roderick bellowed similar commands. Suddenly, the forest grew colder, a chill that numbed limbs and slowed breath. Frost crackled on fallen branches. Men gasped in shock. The White Walker glided forward, stepping over the hacked-apart whites, raising a blade that shimmered like crystallized dawn. One man charged it, sword swinging, only for his steel to snap in half on contact with the other's weapon. The walker moved with uncanny grace, slicing the man open in a single slash. Blood steamed in the air, turning black as it hit the frozen ground. Jon watched in horror. A wave of primal fear crashed over him, threatening to lock his knees. Ghost snarled. Jon forced himself to move, stumbling back, narrowly avoiding a white's outstretched arm. He heard Ned's voice calling him. Theon was somewhere to his right, eyes wide with panic. Rob had turned to rally a few of the men, to keep them from scattering in blind terror. But the presence of the White Walker unhinged many. They broke ranks, scrabbling to climb the ravine's slope. The White Walker advanced calmly, as if it had all the time in the world. Each step brought a deeper hush, a creeping layer of ice. Whites reanimated on the ground behind it, broken limbs jerking, heads rolling toward bodies. Even pieces that had been hacked off twitched. Fire could stop them, but many torches had been dropped in the panic, smothered in snow. Ned Stark, grim-faced, strode forward, brandishing the great sword ice. He had unsheathed it from its protective wrappings, the Valyrian steel glinting in the moonlight. He aimed to hold the walker at bay so his men might escape. The White Walker cocked its head, regarding Ned with something like curiosity. Then it raised its crystal sword. They clashed with a ring that made the air crackle. Sparks flew white and blue. Ned staggered, but the walker's blade did not shatter ice, thanks to the Valyrian steel's ancient magic. Jon, seeing his father locked in mortal combat, felt terror and admiration swirl within him. He tried to sprint forward, but a white blocked his way, hissing. He slashed at it, nearly losing his grip on his sword. The white fell, thrashing. Ghost leapt to tear out its spine. Jon pressed past, slipping on snow slicked with blood. The ravine was chaos. Men shouting, whites crawling or staggering. The White Walker's unnatural aura freezing the air itself. Ned struck again, parrying a swift blow from the walker. The other moved like quicksilver, its inhuman face devoid of warmth or mercy. Each swing of its sword left trails of frost that hung in the air. Ned's breath labored, but he held his ground. Rob and Theon tried to flank the creature, but it flicked its gaze toward them, and they nearly stumbled under that icy stare. Another white lurched between them, forcing them to fight for their lives. Jon saw an opening. The White Walker's back was half-turned as it engaged Ned. Heart pounding, he gripped the obsidian dagger at his belt. He recalled old Nan's tales that dragonglass was the bane of the others. If he could just strike a telling blow. Summoning all his courage, Jon lurched forward, ignoring the trembling in his limbs. He drew close enough to see the strange patterns on the walker's armor, the swirling motifs reminiscent of ice crystals. He smelled a bitter cold that burned his nostrils. His foot crunched on frosted ground, and the walker spun, eyes blazing blue. With a speed John could barely comprehend, the other lashed out. John barely managed to twist aside. The sword's point grazed his cloak, which froze instantly, fibers snapping. John gasped as cold lanced through his shoulder, a brush of frost that made him gasp. But he tightened his grip on the obsidian dagger, lunging forward with a ragged shout. He slammed into the walker's side, the dagger scraping across its armor, then plunging into something that felt like solid ice. For a heartbeat, John feared it would snap in half. But the dagger slid in just beneath an armored plate. A look of shock crossed the walker's unnatural features. It recoiled, and a piercing cry, like the shattering of ice across a frozen lake, erupted from its throat. Then cracks spread through its chest, fracturing that pale flesh. Ned yanked John backward, shielding him as the walker began to disintegrate, flesh crumbling into shards of icy dust. The weapon it bore clattered to the ground, dissolving as well. In seconds, all that remained was a scattering of frost crystals that glistened on the snow. The hush of the moment was broken by the wails of wights, flailing mindlessly. Some collapsed on the spot, as though robbed of their animating force. Others still moved, but more sluggishly. The lines of battle had changed in an instant. The men rallied. Mej Mormont and Ser Roderick pressed the advantage, hacking at the disoriented wights. Firebrand bearers moved in to set them alight. One by one, they dispatched the remaining undead. At last, the ravine fell silent except for the labored breathing of the living and the crackle of small fires. John stared at the spot where the walker had collapsed, panting. His shoulder burned with a numb cold. Ned turned to him, face etched with concern. "John?" he breathed, half in awe, half in worry, checking the boy's arm. Theon stumbled up, wide-eyed, Rob close behind. They all looked at John, 8, nearly 9 years old, still trembling from adrenaline, and the dragonglass dagger in his trembling hand. "You did it," Rob whispered. "You killed it." John felt lightheaded, as though this must be a dream. He started to shake uncontrollably, the cold sinking into his bones. Ghost approached, sniffing him anxiously. I just remembered the stories," John stammered. "Dragonglass, I had to try." Ned wrapped him in a cloak, pulling him close. "7 hells?" Theon muttered, glancing at the glittering shards in the snow. "So it's true. Dragonglass kills them." Mej Mormont stepped forward, blood spattered on her face. "We all saw it," she said. Her voice rang with reverence. "The bastard boy did it." Men still hovered, half shocked, around the aftermath. Ned turned, his face a mask of grim wonder. "The threat is real, but so is their weakness. Pass the word. If we can get more obsidian dragonglass, everyone should carry a dagger or arrow. We might stand a chance." They set about burning the wights, piling them onto a makeshift pyre, ignoring the stench. Some men retched, others prayed. Rob helped John walk to the slope of the ravine, where a maester's aide from the watch examined his injured shoulder, applying salve to stave off the frostbite. Ned oversaw the final destruction of the undead remains, ensuring that nothing could rise again. When they finally returned to Castle Black, dawn was breaking. The men who had stayed behind on the wall rushed forward, anxious. They saw the battered group returning, noticed that losses had been less severe than feared. Word quickly spread that a white walker had been slain, truly slain, by a boy using dragonglass. The tale was recounted with awe, confusion, and relief. Many repeated that this was the first time a living man had killed an other in thousands of years. Jon Snow's name passed from mouth to mouth, accompanied by disbelief that he was so young. He who had first glimpsed them had now struck a mortal blow. Jeor Mormont questioned Ned in private, wanting the precise details. Ned told him everything, including that the Valyrian steel of ice had clashed with the walker's blade without breaking. but it was Jon's obsidian dagger that delivered the killing wound. The old bear listened carefully, nodded, and said they must gather dragonglass from every corner of the realm. But how? Mines near Dragonstone might be the largest source. That meant appealing to Stannis Baratheon or King Robert. After seeing to the wounded, Ned found Jon in an alcove near the common hall, where he sat slumped against a wall, ghost curled at his side. The boy's shoulder was bandaged, and he looked pale with exhaustion, but he was alive. Ned knelt beside him, letting out a shaky breath. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Ned rested a hand on Jon's knee. "I'm proud of you, Jon." The words were quiet but laced with deep emotion. "What you did. You saved us all." Jon's eyes welled with tears. He tried to blink away. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Eventually, Ned turned his gaze away, as though wrestling with complicated feelings. "Your mother would be proud too," he murmured. Then he cleared his throat. "But rest now. You've done more than any boy your age should have to do." Over the next days, Castle Black turned into a hub of frantic preparation. The watchmen redoubled efforts to gather any obsidian. Men hammered new arrowheads from the scraps they had, though they were limited. Ravens flew south to Winterfell, White Harbor, and beyond, each carrying messages that told how Jon Snow had slain a White Walker. That dragonglass was key. Ned penned another urgent missive to King Robert, personally beseeching him to send ships to Dragonstone, to harvest as many shards as possible. He invoked their old friendship, reminding Robert that if the North fell, the entire realm would soon follow. Among the men, a fragile optimism blossomed. They had proved that the others could be hurt, that they were not invincible. However, any illusions of an easy triumph were dispelled by the near disaster in the ravine. The others still commanded legions of whites, and the White Walkers themselves moved with lethal speed. One victory did not mean the war was over. On the contrary, it was only the first major clash in what promised to be a brutal conflict. Jeor Mormont convened a grand meeting with all northern lords and officers of the Night's Watch. Their goal was to outline a long-term defense of the wall. They divided the fortifications into sections, assigned which lords would hold which gate or tower. They planned a system of signals so that, if the others attacked in force at one location, reinforcements could shift from another. Meanwhile, small parties of rangers and wildlings would venture north, seeking to disrupt white gatherings, armed with dragonglass if they had it. The impetus fell on Ned to coordinate with the southern lords for more supplies: grain, steel, furs, and especially obsidian. Each day, watchers atop the wall reported glimpses of movement in the far distance. Sometimes shapes, sometimes flares of pale light. Was it the others gathering? Or just illusions cast by moonlight on ice ridges? No one knew, but the men steeled themselves. Routines of training, repairing walls, and standing watch filled every hour. Jon, his shoulder slowly healing, spent time with the direwolf on top of the wall. He felt caught between childlike exhaustion and a new sense of purpose. He had done something no one else had. He had destroyed one of the others. The men treated him with wary respect, but he often shrank from the attention. He was grateful to be alive, but the memory of the walker's face, the sound of that ice-shattering cry, clung to him. He confided only in Ghost, who pressed a warm muzzle against his cheek. Robb, for his part, found a measure of fame among the knights, having fought bravely in the ravine. He consoled the families of the men who had died, wrote letters to be sent to their homes. Theon reveled in telling the tale of the walker's demise, always making sure to highlight his own role. Ser Roderick was proud of Robb but lamented the bleak situation. Meage Mormont boasted that her Bear Island women had smashed a dozen whites. The men of the Watch only shook their heads, marveling at the fierce loyalty and grit of these northerners. Ned, at the heart of it, carried a new weight. He had watched his own son, his bastard son, slay a legend. He was torn by paternal pride and a deep fear for the boy's future. Jon was too young to bear such burdens, yet fate had placed them upon his shoulders. Ned also struggled with the uncertain politics. Would King Robert heed their call? If the White Walkers mounted a full assault before Southern help arrived, Would the combined might of the North and the Night's Watch be enough? Still, a slender hope flickered. The White Walkers were not gods. They could be killed, at least by certain weapons. Perhaps, if all the North rallied together, if the supply of dragonglass could be increased, the realm stood a chance. Word was also sent to the Iron Islands, to Pike, though none truly expected Balon Greyjoy to come to their aid. Messages flew to the Vale, to the Tullis in Riverrun, to the Lannisters in Casterly Rock, though the Starks had little trust that Tywin Lannister would lift a finger. If Robert commanded it, perhaps that would change. Or perhaps not. Beyond the wall, the wind continued its mournful whisper. Snow blanketed every track, every footprint. Somewhere out there, more White Walkers stirred, piecing together the news that one of their own had fallen to a dragonglass blade. Perhaps it enraged them. Perhaps it emboldened them to gather an even larger host. The living could only guess. So they stood, men and women, lords and bastards, knights and wildlings, all beneath the shadow of that ancient wall. Their torches lit the darkness, fleeting sparks of warmth against the creeping cold. Old Nan's tales lived anew in every flurry of wind, every nighttime hush. The war was not over, only begun. But for the first time in centuries, the living had struck back, had proven the others were not unassailable. Ned Stark clung to that fact like a lifeline, even as he looked upon his battered army and the weary faces of the Watch. Jon's quiet courage, his act of desperation with the dragonglass dagger, had kindled a spark of hope. In the days that followed, that spark burned quietly in every corner of Castle Black. Blacksmiths hammered out obsidian arrowheads, forging them onto shafts with crude adhesives. Rangers drilled in formations, learning to fight side by side with Northern Knights. Families of the fallen received messages of sorrow, while the living found new camaraderie in shared adversity. The enormous threat pressed from the north, the unknown weighed upon them, but a sense of unity also emerged. If a single boy could slay another, then perhaps there was a path to victory. Jon Snow, shivering on top of the wall, looked out across the endless expanse of white. Ghost stood at his side, ears pricked. Clouds drifted overhead, swirling in a bruised purple sky. Jon thought back to that night so long ago when he was 8, creep, ng out of Winterfell in childish curiosity, only to stumble upon the White Walkers. He remembered their glowing blue eyes, the creeping terror. That event had changed everything, launching him and the entire North down this path of early vigilance. Perhaps, he mused, it had spared them an even worse fate. If the others had come and found the North unprepared, the realm might already lie in ruins. Behind him, men guarded the wall, fires crackling in iron braziers, steel glinting in the dying light. Far below, Ned Stark organized more patrols, more strategies. And farther south, ravens carried urgent pleas for men, supplies, unity. The North had risen, led by House Stark, House Mormont, Karstark, Umber, Glover, Bolton, Manderley, and so many others. They stood now, battered but unbroken, defiant on the edge of an ancient frontier. Night was falling again, the wind picking up. Jon drew his cloak tighter around himself. He could almost feel the ice in the air, the hush that preceded danger. Ghost let out a low rumble. "I know," Jon whispered, placing a hand on the direwolf's thick fur. "They're still out there." He lifted his gaze to the horizon, imagining the pale forms drifting through the snow, waiting. The others had come early, forced into the light by the reckless curiosity of one boy. But now that the living knew of their return, the war would be fought with eyes wide open. Somewhere in the swirling gloom beyond the wall, a White Walker might be watching, waiting. Yet it would not find the North sleeping. The watchers on the wall were many. The swords forging in the keep were sharp. The dragonglass arrows glinted black under torchlight. And at the center of it all stood Jon Snow, the boy who should have been invisible, who by chance had discovered the new dawn of an ancient nightmare. Despite the chill in his bones, a faint sense of resolve steadied his heart. They had wounded the night. If the others bled cold, they could be made to bleed again. Thus would begin the next chapter in the battle for the dawn, with the blood of kings, bastards, and common men all mixing in the snow, forging a fire that might yet hold back the endless cold. And so the night drew on and winter deepened, but the North stood vigilant, an army roused too soon for an evil too old, ready or not. Through it all, Jon Snow kept watch from atop the wall, remembering the moment his small dagger of dragonglass had struck home, forever shifting the balance between living and dead. Perhaps fate had chosen him, or perhaps it was only blind chance. Whichever it was, that singular act had given the North its first victory, a slender hope in a war that would test the steel and soul of every mortal heart. And while the White Walkers stirred in the shadows, the living braced themselves, for the true storm had yet to break.